Story 1. The Calmest Pirate in the Caribbean, Stede Bonnet's story. You are not dreaming. You're just listening to the story of a wealthy gentleman who once lived in Barbados in the early 18th century, a man named Stede Bonnet. Perhaps you've never heard of him. That's all right. History nearly forgot him too. But his story, while uneventful in its explosions and naval combat, is a fascinating reflection of human indecision, identity, and what happens when someone who doesn't belong at sea decides to become a pirate. Let's begin with Barbados. It was the year 1717, and Barbados, a jewel in the British colonial crown, sat neatly in the Lesser Antilles, sun-soaked and sweltering. Stede Bonnet was already an unusual figure, a former British Army major, a wealthy landowner and by all appearances, a settled man with a wife, children, and sugar plantations. But beneath the quiet wealth and orderly schedule of a planter's life, something festered. Boredom, perhaps, or dissatisfaction. Some would later say it was a discomfort of mind, a polite euphemism for depression or restlessness. Whatever it was, Bonnet made a decision that no one in his social class had ever made quite so publicly before. He became a pirate. Not joined pirates, not fell in with bad company. No, he purchased a ship, outfitted it at his own expense, hired a crew by paying them wages, unlike most pirate captains who ruled through charisma or brute force, and sailed off like a man pursuing a new hobby. This was no hardened sailor. Bonnet had no nautical experience. He read about ships and voyages. He listened. He took notes. He was the book club version of Blackbeard. His ship, the Revenge, carried 10 cannons, 70 men, and more discomfort than daring. Now imagine this. You, a planter with soft hands and fine boots, are now standing on deck under the Caribbean sun, barking orders about tacking and reefing without really knowing what those words mean. That was Bonnet. He didn't steal the Revenge. He legally owned it, a pirate ship with proper documentation. But what was piracy like in 1717? That year was part of what we now call the Golden Age of piracy, though the term is more romantic now than it ever was then. The Caribbean was thick with shipwrecks, Spanish gold, and merchant vessels weighed down with sugar and indigo. Men like Blackbeard, Edward Teach, Charles Vane, and Calico Jack Rackham roamed the seas, but none of them had the background Stede did. And this made him an anomaly. His early raids were awkward. Sailing around the Carolinas and the Bay of Honduras, Bonnet's ship captured a few merchant vessels. Not many. The success was often due more to the merchant ship's fear than to Bonnet's skill. He reportedly consulted books and diagrams during combat, an unhurried, almost scholarly approach to lawless crime. That wasn't how piracy worked. Still, the Revenge floated. Men were paid, ships were boarded, goods were plundered, but it was all inefficient. Eventually, Bonnet crossed paths with the infamous Blackbeard, a man with a flair for the dramatic and a taste for burning fuses in his beard. Blackbeard quickly saw the problem. Stede Bonnet was not captain material. He may have owned the ship, but on the open sea, ownership mattered far less than command. So Bonnet, perhaps willingly or perhaps under pressure, yielded control of the Revenge to Blackbeard. He became a guest aboard his own ship, a sort of poetic metaphor for how far his fantasy had outpaced his ability. And this was only the beginning of his decline. Still, Bonnet stayed aboard. He watched, listened, perhaps even learned. Blackbeard, for all his terror, had a kind of twisted logic to his method. He projected fear. His goal was to intimidate so thoroughly that violence was often unnecessary. Bonnet, by contrast, seemed to approach piracy with the decorum of a man attempting amateur theater. Their relationship was odd. Bonnet was technically Blackbeard's equal in status, but clearly not in competence. And Blackbeard, never one to suffer fools, had little patience for a gentleman pirate who needed footnotes. Yet they kept sailing together. At one point, Bonnet even received a royal pardon, one of many offered by colonial governors trying to reduce piracy through paperwork rather than war. Bonnet accepted it, hoping to retire peacefully. But Blackbeard, ever the opportunist, used Bonnet's absence to loot his ship and leave him stranded. A betrayal that, strangely, did not incite rage from Bonnet but instead a quiet return to piracy. Perhaps you're wondering, why didn't he just stop? After all, he had money, connections. He had received a pardon, but history tells us he returned to sea under a new name, Captain Thomas, a final attempt to separate himself from the embarrassment of being Stede Bonnet. He assembled a new crew, tried again. And again it went poorly. His next escapade ended with the Battle of Cape Fear River, where Bonnet's ship was surrounded and, after a dull and muddy skirmish, captured by colonial forces. The trial that followed would become one of the most well-documented pirate trials of the century. The charges were straightforward, the outcome predictable. But Bonnet's defense was something else entirely. He claimed he had been forced into piracy, despite all evidence to the contrary. Witnesses testified to his command, his words, his actions. The court was not impressed by his manners or his origin, and the final verdict was death by hanging. Stede Bonnet, the pirate who had once paid his crew like a businessman, read sailing manuals like a student, and approached the high seas with the decorum of a tea party guest, was executed in 1718. But that's not quite the end of his story. Before he died, he wrote letters, apologies, reflections. There was no bravado, no famous last words, just a gentleman out of place to the very end. And it makes you wonder, was Bonnet a failure because he wasn't cut out for piracy, or because piracy wasn't cut out for someone like him? Perhaps the more unsettling question is, what happens when a man tries to rewrite his own story in a world that won't let him? When we last left Stede Bonnet, he had been betrayed by Blackbeard, marooned, and left with a decision. A pardon in hand, he could have returned to his plantation in Barbados and faded into the quiet rhythms of landowner life. But he didn't. Instead, he tried again. But let's not rush. Before we move forward, let's pause to consider how unusual this moment in history was. A pirate in polite clothing. Most pirates were hardened sailors, former naval men, merchant seamen, or laborers pushed into piracy by poverty or abuse. They came from the lower classes and saw piracy as rebellion, profit, or both. Stede Bonnet was not like them. He was literate, educated, wealthy. His clothes were tailored. His manners were formal. He paid for things instead of taking them. And when he first sailed, he paid his crew regular wages like a legitimate employer, rather than splitting plunder shares like traditional pirates. This small difference would go on to cause discontent among his men. Imagine being a sailor, joining a pirate crew expecting freedom and riches, and instead receiving a salary, performance reviews, and perhaps a written policy on cannonball inventory. Bonnet's style was managerial, not anarchic. The men grumbled. Bonnet adjusted. He attempted to learn pirate ways, to imitate the leadership style of more respected captains. But imitation never replaces instinct. In contrast, someone like Blackbeard, who kept slow-burning fuses in his beard and created dramatic, fiery entrances, was all about persona. He understood that piracy was theater. It was about fear, image, and chaos, things Bonnet, with his preference for orderly thinking, simply could not master. The pardon that almost worked. Governor Charles Eden of North Carolina offered King George's Act of Grace, a royal pardon that many pirates accepted as a way out. Bonnet, after his betrayal, found his way to this pardon in early 1718. He was spared officially, but something didn't sit right with him. Was it shame? Was it pride? Or was it the sheer inertia of a life that no longer fit on land? Bonnet decided to pursue legitimate privateering, an interesting halfway point between piracy and legality. He petitioned for a letter of marque, which would allow him to legally attack Spanish ships. That license never came. Whether from impatience or discouragement, Bonnet took to the seas anyway. But now he used a different name, Captain Thomas. Perhaps it was an attempt to erase the embarrassment of his prior failures. Perhaps it was a shield from the weight of his noble reputation. Either way, he returned to piracy, and this time he tried to behave more like his infamous peers. The awkward second act. Under this new name, Bonnet began what we could call his second pirate career. But much like the first, it was hampered by inconsistency and indecision. He targeted small ships. He sailed the coastline of the Carolinas, but he remained an amateur among professionals. His crew, consisting of both hardened seamen and men seeking escape, tolerated him but didn't revere him. He tried harder. He adopted pirate customs, changed the way loot was divided, and even used the Jolly Roger, a black flag with the skull and crossbones, though historians differ on exactly which version he flew. Some accounts suggest a saber beneath the skull, still more stylized than fierce. But Bonnet's ship, Royal James, formerly the Revenge, required repairs. He chose Cape Fear River, a quiet inlet on the coast of North Carolina, to careen the hull, a process of tilting the ship to clean and patch it. It was a risky move. While careening, a ship was vulnerable, immobile, exposed. And that's when Colonel William Rhett of South Carolina entered the picture. Rhett was tasked with pirate suppression. His small fleet tracked Bonnet to Cape Fear. On September 27, 1718, the Battle of Cape Fear River began. It wasn't a grand naval confrontation. It was, like many of Bonnet's escapades, a confusing, sluggish exchange of fire. For 5 hours, the two forces traded cannon fire in the marshy estuary, both grounded on sandbars. They were stuck, like awkward dancers in a slow-motion duel. Bonnet, cornered, ordered his men to fight to the death. But when the tide shifted and Rhett's ship was freed first, Bonnet surrendered. This time there was no Blackbeard to negotiate, no pardon waiting, just ropes, irons, and accusations. He was taken to Charleston, paraded through town as a cautionary tale. Trial and letters. Bonnet was imprisoned in the Provost Dungeon, a notorious underground prison beneath the Exchange Building in Charleston. It was dank, cramped, and foul, far from the plantation halls he once strolled. His trial was not swift. While awaiting judgment, Bonnet wrote letters, perhaps the most honest part of his story. These letters to Governor Johnson and other officials were not threats or justifications, but pleas for mercy, filled with remorse and dignity. In one letter, Bonnet blamed his descent into piracy on Blackbeard's manipulation, despite willingly returning to piracy under his own command. He also made a failed escape attempt with a fellow pirate. They disguised themselves in women's clothing, an almost comic gesture if not so desperate. They were caught. The court saw through the excuses. He was found guilty of piracy and sentenced to be hanged at White Point Garden. His execution was delayed multiple times, perhaps due to intervention attempts by sympathetic figures or bureaucratic delays. He waited, thought, wrote, reflected. And in that reflection, we find the core of Bonnet's story. A man miscast. Stede Bonnet was never meant to be a pirate. Not by training, not by temperament, not by background, but still he tried awkwardly, earnestly, repeatedly. Some historians have labeled him a fool. Others see him as a tragic dreamer. But perhaps he was something simpler, a man miscast in his own life. His desire for escape away from family pressures, away from the stifling life of a colonial gentleman, drove him toward a fantasy that the real world could not sustain. Piracy, for him, was not about blood or treasure. It was about autonomy, about rewriting identity. That it failed twice is not surprising, but the attempt itself remains curiously human. What do you do when the world has already decided who you are and you disagree? Bonnet's answer was to buy a ship, sail into the unknown, and pretend. But there is a cost to pretending, especially on the sea. His final days were quiet. No more letters, No grand speeches, just stillness before the gallows. When the end came on December 10, 1718, he was hanged. A small crowd watched. Some jeered, some may have felt pity. He died not as a villain, but as an outlier, a man who never truly belonged to the age he inhabited. And still, in the footnotes of pirate history, Stede Bonnet remains odd, earnest, and out of place. But before we bring his story to a close, there's one more question we must ask. What made Stede Bonnet choose to return to piracy after receiving a royal pardon, a chance few others ever got? Was it truly pride, loneliness, despair, or something far more ordinary like the ache of having nowhere else to go? It is December 1718. The gallows at White Point Garden in Charleston, South Carolina, have been prepared. The wind is mild, the kind of day when ships gently rock in harbor, and the city, with its dusty lanes and murmuring colonial gossip, is beginning to swell with news. Stede Bonnet is to be executed. But there is little drama. No fierce struggle. No attempt to rally support. Stede Bonnet faces death not with the bluster of a man who fought for loot or freedom, but with the resignation of a man who wandered too far down a path he never fully understood. This is not the way most pirates are remembered, and perhaps that's why Bonnet lingers in the shadows of history, forgotten by most, but fascinating to those who look closely. So how did we get here? And more importantly, what did Bonnet leave behind? A man with no place left to belong. It is easy to imagine Bonnet's return to piracy as a mistake, a foolish misstep, but the deeper truth is more nuanced. Bonnet had been offered a royal pardon, a clean slate as it were, but the pardon was conditional. He had to stop piracy and return to respectable life. For most, this would be an irresistible offer. But not for Bonnet. His plantation was no longer a home. His family ties had frayed. His return to Barbados would have been awkward at best, humiliating at worst. His finances were in disarray from the cost of outfitting the Revenge. And now, he was known not as a landowner or father, but as the gentleman pirate. Returning to normal life was no longer an option. So he chose the only identity left that offered him control, even if it was borrowed, a pirate's life under an assumed name. Yet Bonnet was never able to fully become the role he adopted. He was never fully pirate nor fully gentleman. His existence floated in between. The trial as theater. During Bonnet's trial, the evidence was overwhelming. The court was presented with witness accounts, testimonies from merchant crews, and artifacts from his ship. But perhaps the most telling sign of Bonnet's disconnect from his own reality was his defense. He claimed that Blackbeard had forced him into piracy, and that he had no control over his ship. He tried to present himself as a victim of circumstance. This was not a hardened criminal's defense. This was a bureaucrat's appeal, full of logic and plausible deniability. Bonnet, even at the brink of death, tried to reason with the court, but piracy had little space for reason. It thrived on violence, spectacle, and fear. Even Bonnet's escape attempt, dressed as a woman with another prisoner, lacked the panache or cunning typical of pirate folklore. It was clumsy and unsuccessful. He was caught quickly, adding embarrassment to his list of misadventures. The public followed the case with some curiosity, but Bonnet never became a celebrated villain. He was not feared, he was mocked. He had tried to adopt a pirate's life, but the world wouldn't accept him as one. He had tried to shed his gentleman's image, but it clung to him in every word he spoke. He was, quite simply, a man out of alignment with his time. The hanging at White Point Garden. On the morning of his execution, Bonnet was given a cleric. He is said to have prayed. Some accounts suggest that his final hours were quiet, with no fanfare, no visitors. No final speech has been recorded, no defiant gesture. He was hanged in Charleston on December 10, 1718, and buried nearby in a marshy grave, unmarked, like many pirates before him. There was no statue, no mourning procession, only silence. But it is in that silence that his story gains unusual meaning. What makes Stede Bonnet enduring? Why does Stede Bonnet, a failed pirate, still matter? Because he represents something rarely seen in historical accounts of piracy: vulnerability. Most pirates of the Golden Age were symbols of rebellion, resistance, and violence. Their stories are filled with smoke, swordplay, betrayal, and blood, but Bonnet's story is different. His piracy was an escape not from poverty, but from purpose. He wasn't driven by hunger, but by confusion. Bonnet is remembered not for the ships he sank, which were few, or the riches he stole, which were modest, but because he was the only pirate who tried to enter piracy as if it were a career pivot, a gentleman's side project gone catastrophically wrong. He reminds us that history isn't only shaped by the bold, the brave, or the brilliant. Sometimes it is shaped by the unsure, the awkward, the ones who don't quite fit. And that's precisely why he stands out. He wasn't meant for piracy, and yet he tried again and again because there was nowhere else to go. A quiet reflection. After his death, Bonnet quickly faded from historical memory. His name appeared only occasionally in pirate histories, usually as a footnote. It wasn't until much later, centuries later, that historians and writers began to revisit his life and see it for what it was: a story about identity, dislocation, and human error. In recent years, fictionalized portrayals have turned him into a curious character, sometimes comic, sometimes tragic. Modern readers find in him something more relatable than in most pirates. He's not an icon, he's not a warning, he's something rarer in historical narrative, a human misstep. Piracy as metaphor. If we step back, Bonnet's life can be seen as a broader metaphor. Imagine you're born into a life with all the right appearances: wealth, education, family, and yet something feels off. So you look outward, you try something else, you abandon the script, you chase a life that seems more exciting, more vivid. But once you get there, you discover that the new life also doesn't fit. You don't understand its rules. You aren't built for its challenges. And worse, the people in it don't accept you either. And so you drift between identities, between lives never quite settling. This was Stede Bonnet. His story is not one of glory or even of crime. It is the quiet tragedy of a man who tried to be something he wasn't, in an age that punished confusion. What we can learn. In a strange way, Bonnet's life teaches us about boundaries between classes, between expectations, between fantasy and reality. It teaches us that history isn't just shaped by bold action, but also by misguided longing. It reminds us that even in the age of cannonballs and cutlasses, the most compelling drama could be the quiet unraveling of a man in silk stockings, holding a spyglass with hands that had never truly held a rope. And most of all, it reminds us that not every story worth telling has a triumphant end. Some stories end not with a bang, but with a sigh. Stede Bonnet's grave is unmarked. No monument records his name, but he remains, floating in the historical margins, a man both too refined and too lost to succeed at piracy, and yet for a brief time, a pirate nonetheless. And that, perhaps, is enough to remember him by. Now that we've lowered the curtain on Stede Bonnet's unlikely tale, let us set sail toward our next journey through forgotten history. Story 2. When the post took months, the early British mail coaches. You may not think much about the mail, how it travels, where it begins, and how long it takes to arrive. But once, not long ago by historical standards, receiving a letter from London in Edinburgh could take more than a week, assuming whether bandits and broken axles didn't interfere. In this story, we will gently unfold the tale of the British mail coach system, a network of horses, highways, inns, and post boys that transformed not just communication but daily life, commerce, and even the layout of cities. And it all began with a problem: the unreliability of post riders in 18th century Britain. The state of the post before coaches. Before 1784, the delivery of mail in Britain relied on a rather loose system of mounted postboys, individual riders who carried satchels of letters between towns. These riders were frequently underpaid, poorly equipped, and more crucially unprotected. Mail was slow, letters went missing, robbery was common. A lone boy on a horse, often riding at night, made an easy target. Routes were vague, schedules were looser still. You might send a letter on a Monday and have it arrive on the next Thursday or the next month. Parliament, merchants, and aristocrats alike began to grumble. In an era when news could make or break fortunes, delay meant danger. Something had to change. Enter John Palmer, the theater manager who revolutionized the mail. John Palmer was not a government man. He was a theater manager in Bath, known for organizing performances and managing tight schedules. Theaters, after all, rely on precision. Curtains rise at a certain time, actors enter on cue, and audiences expect consistency. It was this background that made Palmer notice something unusual. His theater companies could travel faster between cities than the Royal Mail. Coaches carrying actors and props loaded down with costumes and scenery were still outpacing the official post. Palmer saw the absurdity in this and proposed an idea that many found laughable: use fast, scheduled stagecoaches to deliver mail. The government, typically cautious, initially resisted, but Palmer pressed and eventually gained permission for a trial run. In August 1784, the first experimental mail coach left Bristol for London. It arrived in 16 hours, a journey that normally took 2 or 3 days by post rider. That changed everything. Standardizing the system, schedules, stations, and uniforms. Palmer's success was swift and undeniable. Within a year, the British Post Office adopted his system. Mail coaches began running between major cities on a schedule, complete with official departure times, appointed routes, and designated inns where horses were changed. Let us pause here to consider this detail: horses. The mail coach system depended on a network of posting inns spaced roughly 10 to 15 miles apart, each responsible for maintaining fresh horses. These inns became essential infrastructure places where a tired coach team could swap its horses in under 5 minutes, keeping the mail moving. Coaches typically carried the driver, a professional, often contracted by the post office, a guard armed with pistols, and a blunderbuss to ward off highwaymen. Occasionally 1 or 2 passengers to defray costs. And most importantly, mailbags stored in a secure, locked compartment. The guards wore red livery, issued horns to signal arrival and departure, and were trained to shoot if attacked. Speed was not only encouraged, it was enforced. The government imposed fines on drivers who arrived late and even allowed postmasters to delay private coaches if the mail coach needed horses first. In short, mail took priority. The roads from Mud to Macadam. We cannot speak of mail coaches without talking about roads. In the early 18th century, Britain's roads were notorious uneven, muddy, and slow. The term turnpike road referred to roads maintained by local trusts who collected tolls to fund improvements. Still, travel remained grueling. Mail coaches helped drive pressure for better roads. With regular, scheduled traffic, the mail system became an economic force pushing for more consistent paving, better drainage, and innovations like John McAdam's compacted gravel surface, which later evolved into tarmac. The mail demanded smoother roads, and smoother roads made the mail faster. A virtuous cycle of infrastructure improvement emerged. Speed as a national ideal. The fastest mail coaches could travel 7 to 10 miles per hour, a stunning pace at the time. This meant London to Edinburgh in under 3 days. London to Bristol in 16-18 hours. Letters posted in the morning could arrive the next day. This new rhythm had cultural consequences. People began timing their lives around mail deliveries. Businesses expected faster responses. Families wrote more frequently. Newspapers began relying on timely posts to distribute regional editions. It was not just about speed, it was about certainty. And in a country that was becoming increasingly modernized, certainty became power. The banality of the bag. For all the grandeur of galloping hooves and red-coated guards, most of the mail was utterly boring. Bills, receipts, orders, invitation, agricultural reports, legal notices, wills, shipping manifests. These were not dramatic letters but the documents of daily life. The mail coach did not just carry news, it carried the glue of society. And because of it, communities were held together. This is where our story becomes quietly extraordinary. Because the true legacy of the mail coach isn't measured in daring chases or heroic rides, it's measured in the fact that you could post a letter on Monday and expect it to arrive on Wednesday. Not because of chance, but because of design. Life along the coach routes. The arrival of scheduled mail had a ripple effect on coaching towns. Inns began advertising their proximity to the coach routes. Businesses flourished in places where the mail stopped. Entire economies bloomed around the 10-minute stop. Blacksmiths, stable boys, hostlers, kitchen staff, wheelwrights. For travelers, the mail coach was the preferred method of long-distance movement, though seats were expensive and limited. Those lucky enough to ride enjoyed a smoother, faster, and safer trip than private coaches. But passengers were strictly second class to the mail. If a conflict arose between comfort and speed, the mail always won. Even the post horn sound became iconic and echo through foggy towns that told the villagers, "The world is moving." The beginning of a national identity. By the early 19th century, mail coaches were a national institution. They were seen as symbols of British efficiency, law, and reach. They were featured in paintings, newspapers, and stories. The guards became folk heroes, sometimes fired upon, sometimes rescuing passengers, always guarding the Queen's mail. But the true brilliance of the system lay not in its drama, but in its reliability. Every bag, every schedule, every mile was part of a quiet symphony of logistics. A world before email, before phones, before trains. Just hooves, wheels, and well-folded paper. And yet, by the 1830s, a new invention would appear on the horizon, one that moved faster, carried more, and didn't need oats or rest. The railway. And it would challenge everything the mail coach stood for. When we left off, the British mail coach system was at its peak, hooves pounding rhythmically across turnpike roads, guards in bright red livery guarding the Queen's mail, and rural inns bustling with the 10-minute chaos of horse swapping. It was an orderly and majestic process, a triumph of synchronized effort in a pre-industrial age. But like all well-oiled systems of the 18th century, the mail coach would soon face a challenge not from nature or rebellion, but from technology. Enter the steam railway. The first whistle, a new age arrives. It began slowly, almost politely. In 1825, the world's first public railway to use steam locomotives, the Stockton and Darlington Railway, opened in the north of England. It was primarily used for transporting coal. Then came 1830, and with it the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, a line that carried passengers and freight alike. For the first time, speed and reliability matched and then quickly outpaced the fastest coaches. The implications for the mail system were clear. Railways could move more, move faster, and move regardless of weather. Snow, mud, and broken axles were no longer obstacles. What had taken a coach 10 hours, the train could manage in 3. Still, change did not come immediately. There was resistance. Mail coach contractors worried about lost income. Inns along the coach routes feared economic collapse. Even the post office was hesitant at first, cautious of placing its most sacred institution into the hands of private railway companies. But change, like the railway itself, was inevitable. Integrating the iron horse. In 1838, under growing pressure, the British Post Office began experimenting with mail trains. The first official railway mail service began on the Grand Junction Railway, linking Birmingham and Liverpool. Letters were loaded into special mail carriages, with postal clerks on board to sort letters, while en route, an innovation that dramatically increased efficiency. This began the slow process of transition. The traditional mail coach routes were gradually replaced by railway lines. At first, coaches continued to deliver to towns not yet connected by rail, but with every new line laid, another segment of the coach network became obsolete. To maintain continuity, mail vans, early forms of postal trucks, began to operate from train stations, extending the reach of the new system without abandoning remote villages. The old and the new overlapped for a time. You might see a coach pulling into a sleepy hamlet while, just a few miles away, a train was roaring past fields at impossible speeds. One was driven by a man in a greatcoat with reins and whip, the other by a fireman and engineer feeding coal into a hungry furnace. Both carried letters, but only one carried the future. The decline of the coaching inns. As the railways spread across Britain, the posting inns, once the lifeblood of the mail coach system, began to empty. Stables fell silent. The blacksmith's hammer rang less often. The once thriving inns that served as regional hubs saw their traffic dwindle. Some adapted, becoming regular pubs or general lodging houses. Others closed entirely. Entire villages that had grown prosperous along coach routes entered decline, bypassed by the straight, steel rails that favored flat landscapes and urban centers. There was no outcry, no revolution, just a slow dampening of noise. Even the horses, those muscular engines of the mail world, were retired or repurposed. Coaching companies either shut down or shifted to pleasure travel, offering scenic rides rather than high-speed communication. And the guards, once symbols of courage and authority, disappeared altogether. Their pistols, horns, and uniforms became curiosities sold at auction, left in trunks, or displayed in roadside museums. The mail coach, once the pinnacle of precision and security, had become a relic. The railway mail service takes over. By the 1840s, the transition was nearly complete. The post office, now convinced of the railway's superiority, shifted the bulk of mail delivery to trains. Postal trains ran day and night with dedicated staff on board. Letters were sorted in motion, an incredible advancement for the time. Efficiency soared. A letter posted in Liverpool might now reach London by morning. Scotland, which once took 3 to 5 days, could now be reached in less than 24 hours. Even more impressive was the mail-on-the-fly system, introduced later in the 19th century. Mailbags could be hooked and collected by moving trains without stopping, thanks to a swinging arm mechanism beside the tracks. This allowed remote areas to send and receive mail without requiring a station stop. The very concept of time was reshaped. Timekeeping and the mail. Before trains, local time varied from town to town. Noon in Oxford might be 5 minutes earlier than noon in London. It wasn't a problem until railways and scheduled mail required synchronized time. And so, partly because of mail, railway time was introduced, an early attempt at standardizing clocks across Britain. Eventually, this would evolve into Greenwich Mean Time, GMT, adopted officially in the 1880s, all because mail needed to run on time. So in a quiet way, the legacy of the mail coach lives on every time you check your watch. cultural memory, and sentiment. Despite the speed and efficiency of the railway, the mail coach left behind a sense of romantic nostalgia. Writers like Charles Dickens and Thomas de Quincey described their journeys by coach with a kind of reverence. The coach horn, once a signal of order and progress, became a symbol of a lost age. By the 1850s, most major routes had been transferred to rail. A few minor coaches continued into the 1860s, mostly in regions where rails had not yet reached. And then one by one, the last wheels turned. There was no final run, no ceremony, just fewer hoofbeats until there were none at all. A legacy in layers. So what did the mail coach leave behind? Road networks that would one day become the foundation of Britain's modern highways. Postal districts and timetable that set the model for global delivery standards. In towns and service stops, some of which would become lasting urban centers. And perhaps most subtly, an expectation of communication. The idea that a message should arrive on time, safely, and predictably that began with the mail coach. The image of a coach, silhouetted on a ridge at dawn, with mist curling behind it and a guard's horn echoing across the valley, it still lives, even if only in imagination. But we are left with one question. The mail coach was not defeated by scandal or corruption, it was outpaced by invention. But could something so carefully built, so beloved, really vanish so quickly? What happens to a system when its perfection is no longer enough? The mail coaches are gone. The stables are quiet. The post horns hang on museum walls, and the rutted roads that once echoed with hooves now carry automobiles and lorries. The inns still stand in some places, their signs faded, their tap rooms converted, their function reimagined. But as we step into this final chapter, we are not simply watching the end of a transportation system, we are watching the birth of a mindset that still governs how we communicate today. To understand that legacy, we must look beyond the coaches themselves and explore what they changed, how they endured, and what they taught us about time, trust, and the fragile infrastructure of connection. From movement to memory. By the 1870s, almost every major mail route in Britain had been overtaken by the railway. The last few coach routes held out only in remote or mountainous areas, and even those disappeared as rural rail lines crept into valleys and over hills. But even as the coaches vanished from the roads, their infrastructure remained. Roads carved by coach wheels became standardized postal roads, later adapted for automobiles. Coaching inns, especially in cities like Bath, York, and London, were repurposed into hotels or municipal buildings. Postal depots established to receive coach mail evolved into modern sorting facilities. There is a kind of quiet dignity in this transformation. No fanfare marked the final coach journey. No monument was raised to the guards who rode through sleet and fog, but the expectations they created, speed, reliability, accountability, became the DNA of modern communication. The psychology of predictability. Before the mail coach system, people sent letters with little confidence of delivery. The act of writing a letter was more an act of hope than expectation. But the introduction of scheduled routes, guarded deliveries, and centralized drop points made mail something profoundly new, predictable. You could plan a meeting around the arrival of a letter, arrange a shipment based on a confirmation, discuss events that happened just days ago, not weeks. That predictability reshaped trust. The mail became a promise that your words would arrive, and that others' words would arrive too. This trust extended beyond communication. It began to affect commerce, government, and daily social rhythms. And once that trust was established, it didn't vanish. The system that had built it might fade, but the public expectation of timely, secure communication remained permanent. Influence beyond Britain. Britain's mail coach system didn't exist in isolation. It became a model for other countries. In Ireland, coaches followed similar systems, though with shorter routes and different challenges of terrain and politics. In France, Napoleon admired the British model and implemented comparable reforms through the mail-post system. In the United States, the mail coach system was an early inspiration for the Pony Express and later stagecoach routes used in the American West. Wherever mail coaches went, they brought with them the same quiet revolution, the transformation of communication from occasional to routine. Symbols of national order. In the popular imagination, mail coaches became more than transportation, they became symbols of civic order. Artists painted them cresting over hills at sunset. Writers, from Jane Austen to Charles Dickens, described their comings and goings with admiration and occasional satire. Carols and poems referenced the post horn, a once-ordinary sound that had become almost mythic by the late 19th century. There was even a kind of social ritual to their arrival. Townspeople might stop what they were doing to gather as the coach arrived. Children watched the horses. Merchants waited for news. The mayor might receive official correspondence directly from the guard. Though short-lived in historical terms, mail coaches left an emotional imprint on the nation. Objects left behind. What survives of them? You can still see. Brass post horns, polished and preserved in postal museums. Red-coated uniforms, tailored and displayed behind glass. Wax-sealed mailbags, faded and frayed, once filled with documents so mundane that they are now rare. Even the coaches themselves, some restored, some reconstructed, stand in corners of heritage centers. But the more important relics are less tangible. The schedules they inspired became timetables for trains, then buses, then flights. The postmarks and standardized envelopes laid the groundwork for bureaucratic filing. The national networks built to serve the coaches became the same paths followed by telegraph lines, railroads, and fiber optic cables. From hooves to high-speed broadband, it's all connected. Lessons from a lost system. What can a 200-year-old postal coach teach us? It reminds us that infrastructure is not just about movement, it's about reliability. The mail coach system didn't win hearts through drama, but through repetition. Day after day, night after night, it did what it said it would do. It also reminds us that systems matter more than symbols. The red coat of the mail guard, the fanfare of the horn, these caught the public eye. But behind the symbolism were hundreds of workers, stable boys, innkeepers, horse breeders, and clerks, all operating in concert. That kind of unseen harmony is still what makes modern systems function, whether in airports, call centers, or data servers. The quiet lesson of the mail coach is this: progress does not always gallop. Sometimes it trots, predictably, persistently, and with a clear destination in mind. And yet a question lingers. Why do we remember them at all? They were inefficient by today's standards. They were noisy, slow, and limited, yet they left behind something more lasting than iron rails or combustion engines, a culture of connection. They turned the act of waiting for a letter into a ritual of trust. And even now, when an envelope drops through your mail slot, however ordinary, it may seem, it still carries echoes of that legacy. A letter is not just paper. It is a message in motion, the physical representation of a system that once galloped through the mist, brass horn ringing. So next time you check your mailbox, whether digital or wooden, pause for a moment. Somewhere behind that delivery is a lineage that began with sweating horses, splattered wheels, and a red-coated guard staring at the road ahead. And ask yourself this: what parts of today's systems will vanish quietly, and what parts will echo long after the wheels stop turning? Story 3. Salted cod and long voyages, food logistics in the age of sail. You are aboard a ship. The wind groans against the sails, canvas snapping with every shift in the breeze. The sea stretches endlessly in every direction, and somewhere in the hold below, nestled among wooden barrels, sits a substance more valuable than gold to a sailor. Salted cod. This plain, unremarkable fish, dry, white, stiff as wood, was the beating heart of global naval logistics for centuries. Not because it was delicious, not because it was rare, but because, quite simply, it did not rot. And in the age of sail, when voyages lasted weeks, months, or even years, that was enough to make it indispensable. This is not the story of a war or a revolution. This is the story of how ordinary sailors, officers, merchants, and dockhands survived at sea through boring, brittle, preserved food, and how salted cod helped feed not just bodies, but empires. The spoilage problem. Let's begin with the challenge. In the 17th through 19th centuries, ships had no refrigeration. There were no ice boxes, no vacuum-sealed containers. Everything rotted fast. Fresh meat turned sour within days. Fruits and vegetables spoiled in a week. Bread went moldy or was eaten by weevils. Beer went flat. Water developed algae. So, feeding a ship for a long voyage, let alone a navy of dozens or hundreds of ships, required planning that bordered on logistical wizardry. The solution: preservation. And the most reliable method available to early modern seafarers was salting, especially when it came to fish. Salt pulled moisture from flesh, inhibiting bacterial growth. A properly salted cod could last months or even years if kept dry and stored properly. But salt alone wasn't enough. You needed the right fish, the right process, and an entire industry to scale it. That's where cod came in. Why cod? Why not other fish? Cod, specifically the Atlantic cod, Gadus morhua, was almost tailor-made for preservation. It had thick, meaty fillets that dried well, low oil content, reducing rancidity, mild flavor, which could be disguised or dressed up in a ship's galley, bones that were easily removed, making it cleaner to pack. And most importantly, cod was abundant. The Grand Banks off Newfoundland's shallow, nutrient-rich waters teemed with cod. So did the North Sea. And by the 1600s, European fishing fleets from England, France, Portugal, and Spain had all discovered and exploited these regions. It became a cycle. Cod was caught in bulk, salted and dried on shore or aboard ships, and then shipped back to Europe or down to the Caribbean to support colonial outposts, merchant ships, and naval squadrons. It was cheap, filling, and portable. In short, the perfect food for long voyages. How salted cod was made. The process was laborious but simple. Catch the fish. Large cod were caught by hand lines or nets and hauled aboard wooden vessels. Gut and split. Each fish was gutted, its head removed, and its body split open. The process was fast, and experienced fishermen could do dozens per hour. Salting. Layers of cod were packed into barrels or laid on stone slabs with liberal amounts of salt in between. Salt was expensive but necessary. One wrong ratio, and the fish would spoil within weeks. Drying. On land, cod was often air-dried on wooden racks called flakes for several weeks. The cold sea air, especially in northern climates, slowed spoilage. This part of the process made the cod hard, light, and transportable. Storage. Once dried, the cod was stacked and stored in holds below deck, kept dry and safe from seawater. It was not glamorous work. The process was smelly, monotonous, and required constant monitoring. A single rainstorm could ruin hundreds of pounds of drying fish, but it was necessary. And once salted and dried, the cod could go anywhere. Who ate the cod? Everyone. Let us now picture the sailors. Aboard ships of the Royal Navy or a Dutch East India Company vessel, men might be fed salted cod 3 to 4 times a week, boiled into stews, or served alongside hardtack. a biscuit so dry it could survive decades. In Catholic countries like Spain or France, salted cod became a religious necessity as meat was forbidden on Fridays and during Lent. Cod filled the gap. In the Caribbean, slaves were fed with salted cod imported from Newfoundland and New England. It became a staple in plantation economies, where low-cost bulk food was essential to feeding large enslaved populations. In Portugal, Italy, and West Africa, it evolved into culinary traditions dishes like bacalhau, Portuguese cod stew, or Caribbean saltfish and ackee. In other words, this bland, dry fish was a silent global traveler, and everyone from sailors to slaves to aristocrats ate it. Cod in the business of empire. But it wasn't just about food, it was about money and control. The cod trade was big business. So big, in fact, that wars were fought over fishing rights, navies were built to protect cod fleets, and colonies rose and fell around who could access the best grounds. Consider this. The English colonization of Newfoundland was driven as much by cod as by conquest. Settlers built fish-drying stations. Seasonal workers came from Devon and Cornwall. The economy ran on fish, salt, and labor. Governments subsidized cod fleets. Mercantilist policies ensured that cod profits returned to the home country. Even salt itself became a commodity, with huge operations in places like salt pans in France and Portugal's Setúbal region, whose only purpose was to feed the cod trade. The combination of salt and cod created a logistics triangle. Salt from southern Europe, cod from the North Atlantic, consumers across the globe. This wasn't just food preservation. This was imperial logistics. A quiet lifeline at sea. For the average sailor, though, there was no economic theory, just the constant taste of brine and chew. A typical naval ration in the 18th century included 1 pound of salted meat, beef or cod per day, 1 pound of hardtack, 1 gallon of beer or watered-down rum, peas or oats once a week, butter or cheese when it hadn't spoiled. Salted cod was among the least offensive of these items. It didn't spoil easily, it was lighter than beef, and it could be mixed with ship's biscuit to form fish hash, a sticky stew boiled in large pots over a swinging stove. Cooking aboard ship was its own ordeal. The galley fire had to be closely managed to avoid risk of blaze. Meals were typically served lukewarm, eaten from shared bowls, and seasoned with little more than pepper or vinegar. Yet for many sailors, salted cod was a rare moment of familiarity, a reminder of coastal life, of childhood meals, of something vaguely homemade. Even at sea, far from land, cod was comfort. But there was one problem. Salted cod was practical, but it wasn't nutritious enough on its own. Voyages that relied too heavily on preserved food, without fresh fruit or vegetables, led to one of the most feared afflictions in naval history: scurvy. The lack of vitamin C in preserved diets led to swollen gums, fatigue, bleeding, and eventual death. Cod, despite its protein content, could not prevent this, so while it fed the body, it could not sustain health forever. Later efforts by navies would introduce lime juice, sauerkraut, and onions to ship diets, but for decades, salted cod was both lifeline and liability. A dependable friend that, if relied upon too long, quietly betrayed the body. So now, as we look at the barrels below deck packed with brittle white fillets, one question remains. How did a humble fish come to shape global trade, survival, and even religion, without ever being noticed? When you think of empires, those of Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, you likely imagine flags, armies, navies, perhaps gold or spices. But rarely does a salted fish come to mind. Yet behind the gleaming surface of imperial conquest, something unremarkable and dry sat at the center of a trade web that stretched from the Grand Banks of Newfoundland to the plantations of the Caribbean. from the salt flats of southern Europe to the tables of West Africa. The salted cod trade, slow and methodical, fed millions. It made fortunes quietly, and like most logistical wonders, it worked best when it was forgotten when it simply arrived. In this section, we'll trace the cod trade triangle, a system of economic exchange that bound together empires, colonies, and the very geography of Atlantic life. The Atlantic Triangular Trade, Cod's Corner. You may have heard of the Atlantic Triangular Trade, the system in which Europe, Africa, and the Americas were bound in a cycle of manufactured goods, slaves, and raw materials. But what's often forgotten is that the triangle had many corners, and not every voyage was part of the same grim circuit. One lesser-known triangle revolved not around sugar or rum, but around cod, salt, and labor. Let's walk through a typical trade cycle. New England or Newfoundland. Ships were loaded with salted cod caught from the cold waters of the Atlantic and processed by fishermen working from small, rugged coastal outposts. The Caribbean. The cod was offloaded to slave plantations in exchange for molasses, sugar, or money. Planters needed a cheap protein source for enslaved laborers. Salted cod became a dietary staple served daily, often boiled or mashed with ground provisions. Europe or back to New England. Ships returned with manufactured goods, or sometimes brought Caribbean goods northward to be refined, such as turning molasses into rum. Unlike other triangles that dealt in human cargo, this one revolved around preserved protein, but it was no less critical to the functioning of the colonial machine. Salted cod made enslaved labor more sustainable, a disturbing but historically vital fact. It kept costs low, it ensured minimal spoilage, and it could be shipped in vast quantities with little oversight. Cod's place in Caribbean and slave economies. On plantations across Jamaica, Barbados, Saint Domingue, and Trinidad, salted cod was not a luxury, it was a staple. Plantation owners were often reluctant to devote land or labor to food production. Their wealth came from sugar cane, not vegetables or livestock. As a result, most food for enslaved workers had to be imported. Salted cod, usually broken into flakes and mixed with starchy crops like cassava, breadfruit, or plantains, became the nutritional backbone of millions. It is a bitter irony. A cold-water fish became central to tropical life. And even after emancipation, salted cod remained embedded in Caribbean cuisine. It evolved into regional dishes. Saltfish and ackee in Jamaica. Bacalaos, salt cod fritters in Puerto Rico. Brandade de Morue in French colonies. In each, the cod is rehydrated, seasoned, simmered, sometimes fried, but always present, always inherited from its earlier purpose, preservation and provision. Salt, the other pillar. Cod could not travel without salt. Salt production was an industry unto itself. Large-scale salt works existed across France, Brittany, and Languedoc, Portugal, and Spain. Salt was extracted through solar evaporation, harvested by hand, and stacked in great pyramids beside windswept flats. In places like Setúbal, Cadiz, or the Isle de Ré, entire towns worked year-round to create one commodity: salt for fish. Even the British Royal Navy, though a dominant sea power, often relied on foreign sources for its salting needs. Salt was so important, in fact, that it was taxed and regulated tightly. Smuggling salt, or evading salt taxes, could lead to prison. And just as cod fed the people, salt kept the cod alive. Fishing stations and the life of fishermen. Let us now turn to the men who caught the fish. Fishing fleets sailed from Newfoundland outposts, Nova Scotia, Massachusetts, notably Gloucester and Marblehead, Brittany, Basque ports. Fishermen worked from small boats called shallops, dropping hand lines into the cold Atlantic. Cod were hauled in by the dozens, gutted on the spot, and packed in salt within hours. This was no easy life. Seasons were short but intense. Crews rose before dawn. Work was wet, cold, and repetitive. Tallymen tracked catches. Cooks prepared meager meals. The best fishing grounds were foggy and rough, and more than a few men were lost at sea, dragged overboard or capsized in squalls. Once ashore, the fish were dried on wooden flakes, raised racks of slats where sun and air completed the preservation process. Entire communities worked in silence, with salted hands and cracked fingernails, ensuring that the cod became hard, white slabs, ready for barrel and cargo. This labor, unseen by those eating the cod, was the silent machinery behind empire. Cod and conflict. Wherever cod was plentiful, conflict followed. The waters off Newfoundland were heavily contested. The French, English, and Spanish each laid claim to regions of the Grand Banks. Treaties would divide fishing zones. Colonial outposts would be seized not for gold or timber, but for access to fish. For example, the Treaty of Utrecht, 1713, gave Britain exclusive rights to fish along Newfoundland's northern coast, rights they guarded jealously. The French shore, a stretch of land on Newfoundland's western coast, remained a diplomatic sticking point into the 20th century. Naval skirmishes were occasionally fought over fish. Harbors were fortified. Fisheries were considered strategic assets. Cod, though humble, was too valuable to ignore. Even the American Revolution was partly influenced by cod. New England merchants resented British restrictions on their access to foreign salt and fish markets. Cod, in its quiet way, helped fuel independence movements, colonial rivalries, and imperial policy. Cod's quiet economic power. Historians often forget the middle level of empire: the merchants, insurers, barrel makers, sailcloth weavers, and coopers, whose lives revolved around the cod trade. A single cod voyage required ships and outfitting, barrels hundreds per cargo hold, salt from European suppliers, dockworkers for loading and unloading, clerks to process customs papers, bookkeepers to handle ledgers and balances. In ports like Lisbon, Portsmouth, Boston, and St. John's, entire streets were built on cod money. Wealth was modest but consistent. Fortunes were made not by pirates or nobles, but by men who sold preserved protein in bulk. It was, in essence, the logistics business before logistics had a name. And yet cod never spoiled its welcome. What's remarkable is how long cod remained useful. In the age of sail, it was vital for survival. In the industrial age, it became a factory-processed good. In the 20th century, it survived world wars, famines, and Depression-era kitchens. Even today, cod is eaten all over the world, often salted, often rehydrated, often passed down in recipes that once began in a ship's galley or a slave's cookhouse. But with all its influence, cod never became glamorous, never expensive, never rare. It remained a working-class food, quietly present, quietly preserved. And perhaps that's what makes its role in history so fascinating. But still, we must ask, how did a food so tied to empire and labor, so essential to survival, come to nearly vanish in the modern world? What happened to the fisheries, the towns, the trade routes? The sea always seems infinite. But behind that illusion lies a harder truth: plenty is not permanence. For hundreds of years, the Atlantic cod was harvested by the ton. Generations of fishermen worked its waters, armies marched on it, empires were fed by it. And then it was gone. Not all at once, not with a storm or a war, but quietly, almost invisibly, as if the sea itself had forgotten where it had once kept its bounty. This is the story of the decline of cod, the end of an era, and the quiet cultural mourning that followed. Because even the most boring foods, the most ordinary logistics, hold power until they vanish. The warning signs begin. By the late 19th century, the cod trade had already begun to shift. Steamships replaced sailing vessels. Refrigeration changed food storage. Canning became cheaper. New foods, new proteins, and new preferences emerged across growing cities. Yet cod remained a staple, cheap, familiar, and embedded in culture. But beneath the surface, the signs were there. Catch sizes shrank. Fishing grounds yielded less. Fishers went farther out, stayed longer, worked harder. The cod were still there, but not in the numbers of the past. And in places like Newfoundland, Iceland, and New England, where entire towns had grown around cod, anxiety began to creep into the docks. But technology kept pushing forward. Boats grew larger, nets deeper. Sonar helped locate shoals. The sea gave less and we took more. The collapse of the Grand Banks. Then in 1992, the unthinkable happened. Canada closed the Grand Banks cod fishery, a decision that stunned the nation. Centuries of fishing had ended in a single policy move. Why? Because the cod were gone, not extinct, but so few in number that recovery might take decades if it happened at all. Over 35,000 people lost their jobs overnight. Fishing villages became ghost towns. Boats were dry docked and left to rust. Nets, once vital tools, now hung limp in sheds. The ocean that had once fed Europe's navies, Caribbean plantations, and working-class kitchens across the globe had nothing left to offer. The fish that had supported empires had simply stopped appearing. How did it happen? Historians and scientists point to several causes. Overfishing. For centuries, cod seemed endless. Fishing was encouraged, scaled, industrialized. No quotas existed in the early years. By the time limits were considered, it was too late. Trawling and bycatch. Large-scale industrial trawling not only caught adult cod, but destroyed seafloor habitats and killed juveniles, disrupting the reproductive cycle. Climate and ecosystem change. Warming ocean temperatures shifted the cod's traditional range. Competing species, like seals, grew in number, while plankton cod's food moved to colder zones. Regulatory delay. Government response was slow and politically cautious. No one wanted to shut down an industry that employed thousands, so the problem worsened until collapse became the only option. In the end, it was not a dramatic failure, it was death by inertia. Cultural losses and lingering ghosts. In Newfoundland, the closure of the cod fishery was more than economic, it was existential. Songs, stories, family legacies all revolved around fishing. Boats were passed down, not sold. Fishing wasn't just a job, it was identity. Suddenly, that identity no longer had a place. Old men sat in empty harbors, watching tides that no longer brought wealth. Young people left in search of work. Communities, once loud with the sound of nets being mended and fish being salted, now echoed with silence. In museums, cod became a curiosity. In cookbooks, a memory. Cod in the modern world. Today, cod is still eaten, but much of it is farmed, imported, or fished under strict quotas. Salted cod remains central to cuisines in Portugal, where bacalhau is considered a national dish. West Africa, where it features in stews and fritters. Caribbean nations, where it's still served in family gatherings. But the traditional trade North Atlantic catch, hand salting, sun-drying on wooden flakes, and barrel shipment across oceans has all but vanished. It has been replaced by cold storage, mechanized processing, and faster supply chains. The fish is the same, the flavor lingers, but the world that built it is gone. Legacy and logistics. And yet, the cod story did something remarkable. It gave the world a logistical blueprint. Long-haul food transport, cold storage and preservation systems, global supply networks, nutritional planning for large populations. These are not thrilling inventions, but they formed the infrastructure of civilization. And much of it began not with kings or inventors, but with the need to keep fish from rotting. Salted cod taught the world how to think about distance, storage, and timing, all critical elements of modern global trade. And it did so from the shadows. The final voyages. A few traditional cod voyages still happen for show, for culture, for memory. Heritage fleets sail out of Gloucester or St. John's, using old designs and recreating the journey. But the days of drying cod in the wind, of weighing it in bulk on harborside scales, are gone. Instead, we find cod in supermarkets vacuum-sealed, frozen, sliced into fillets. Convenient, tastelessly uniform. The boredom of efficiency has replaced the risk of tradition. But there is value in remembering. Because sometimes, the most important parts of history are not the revolutions or declarations, but the small, repetitive acts that kept people alive. Splitting fish, sprinkling salt, packing barrels, feeding the crews that mapped the world. A reflection when the mundane becomes essential. Salted cod was never glamorous. It was never a delicacy. It didn't win wars or build cathedrals. It didn't shape ideology. But it fed the people who did. And that is its power. So next time you eat a piece of fish, or see a wooden barrel, or walk past a crumbling fishing wharf, pause. Listen for the echo of quiet labor. Think of the fish that once fed fleets. And ask yourself, what other essentials of our world, quiet, boring, taken for granted, might vanish before we even notice they're gone? Story 4. The Disappearing Clerks of the Hanseatic League. Close your eyes, if you like, and picture a bustling port in the mid-14th century. It is Lubeck, a city of gray stone walls, steep gabled roofs, and warehouses packed with barrels of herring, rolls of Flemish cloth, crates of beeswax, and bundles of hemp rope. The air smells of salt, tar, and ink. Bells ring in the harbor. Seagulls circle the masts. And in a dim back room behind one of these warehouses sits a man, quill in hand, shoulders hunched, eyes tired. He is a clerk, perhaps no more than 17, copying numbers into a leather-bound ledger with brown ink. He records ship name, dates of departure, goods exchanged, and amounts owed. He is not famous. He will never be mentioned in a poem, but he is part of an empire not of kings but of commerce. This is the Hanseatic League, and this is a story about the men who quietly made it work until they vanished. What was the Hanseatic League? The Hanseatic League, or Hansa, was a medieval commercial confederation, a cooperative network of merchants and cities that stretched across northern Europe, from the Netherlands to Russia, from London to Tallinn. It was not a country. It had no monarch, no army, no flag. Instead, it functioned through treaties, contracts, and mutual agreements. It was a world built on paperwork, precedent, and trade. At its height, roughly 1,350–1,500, the League connected over 200 towns. Cities like Lubeck, Hamburg, Riga, Bremen, Königsberg, and Novgorod thrived under its system. Its power came not from battle, but from the ability to organize trade with extraordinary precision and predictability. Goods flowed like rivers. Salted herring from the Baltic, cloth from Flanders, grain from Poland, timber and tar from the vast forests of the East. Luxury goods from Venice passed northward by river barge and ox cart. The League managed trade without central oversight, relying on merchant guilds, local rules, and most critically, clerks. These clerks were the engineers of commerce, quietly maintaining a vast and complex world that most never saw. The role of the clerk. To be a Hansa clerk was to live between two worlds. You were literate in an age when many were not. You knew Latin, Low German, and numbers. You understood weights and measures across regions. You recognized coinage from a dozen states. You tracked debts across borders. A clerk's daily life was filled with copying ship manifests, translating contracts, converting currencies, maintaining debt records, notarizing trade deals, drafting letters for faraway partners. They worked in Contour's Hanseatic trading outposts established in key cities such as London, the Steelyard, Bergen, Bruges, and Novgorod. Inside these contours, behind thick wooden doors, lay piles of ledgers, maps, wax seals, and dry ink pots. Clerks lived on site, often in communal dormitories, working in semi-monastic silence punctuated by the scratch of quills. It was a world ruled by routine and order, not ambition. The culture of quiet power. Though technically employed by merchant guilds, Hanseatic clerks occupied a unique place in society. They were not noble, but they lived more comfortably than most artisans. They were not merchants, but had access to wealth, gossip, and sensitive information. They rarely traveled, but knew the pulse of a continent. They were sometimes called Schreiber writers in the purest sense, but their writing didn't produce stories or laws, it produced functionality. Clerks standardized formats for contracts. They helped settle disputes with written precedent. They managed communication between cities where verbal agreements might be lost or misunderstood. They were the database of the medieval North human servers, trained to remember, record, and retrieve. And yet most of their names are lost. Their ledgers survive, but their lives are footnotes. The rhythms of the League. Trade moved slowly but surely through the Hansa. A ship left Riga with flax and furs. It stopped at Visby for salt, arrived in Hamburg where goods were repackaged, then carried west to Bruges where it was exchanged for cloth, wine, and coins. Every step required documentation. The date of departure and arrival, the name of the captain, the exact weight of cargo, down to the last stone or ell, the port fees paid and taxes expected, the name of the merchant to receive the goods. None of this could be left to memory, and so clerks tracked it all. If a ship was delayed, a letter might be sent written by a clerk, sealed with wax and handed to a rider. If a crate was short of expected weight, the clerk would file a complaint, cross-reference earlier manifests, and deduct the value from a running total. It was dull, meticulous, and utterly essential. When disasters came, clerks took the notes. The Hanseatic League was not immune to disruption. Fires swept through ports and contours. Wars blocked trade routes. Plagues killed dockworkers and merchants alike. Political unrest changed customs overnight. In these moments, the clerks became the stabilizers. They tracked the missing goods. They renegotiated delayed contracts. They preserved continuity by keeping the records whole. One 15th century ledger from the Steelyard in London contains entries for ships that never arrived with notes like feared lost in fog, payment delayed pending news. Another from Bruges notes, exchange rates unstable suggest caution in coin transfers. Their observations were not literary, but they preserved moments in economic history with astonishing calmness. They didn't stop the storm, but they kept the calendar intact. But something began to change. By the mid-15th century, cracks began to appear in the League's influence. New trade routes opened as the Portuguese explored the Atlantic coast. Nation-states grew stronger: France, England, Denmark, reducing the need for a trade federation. Internal rivalry between Hanseatic cities disrupted cooperation. The rise of Amsterdam as a dominant port challenged Lübeck's primacy. Clerks, so central to the League's order, began to vanish as well. Their roles were taken over by state bureaucrats who used royal seals rather than guild stamps, private merchants who hired secretaries with more flexible loyalties, shipping companies who standardized their own internal records. By the early 1600s, the Hanseatic League was a memory. It officially dissolved in 1669, though by then it had been irrelevant for decades. The clerks, too, faded. Their records remained, their names did not. And yet their fingerprints are still on every customs form, every invoice, every shipping manifest used today. By the early 1500s, the cities of the Hanseatic League were still standing. The ports still opened. Ships still sailed with wax seals and herring barrels. But something had shifted, a loosening, a sense that the world had begun to outpace its own ledgers. And in the quiet back offices of the contours in London, Bergen, Bruges, and Novgorod, the clerks who once defined the rhythm of trade began to feel a change they couldn't quite name. It wasn't war, it wasn't plague. It was simply this: the world stopped needing them. From local precision to global chaos. The clerks of the Hanseatic League had built a system that depended on trust, repetition, and record-keeping. Cities cooperated. Ships sailed on routine. Trade flowed through known ports, along predictable routes. But by the 16th century, that certainty was breaking down. The age of discovery had begun. The Atlantic world was opening. Spain and Portugal were now importing silver, sugar, and spices from far beyond Europe. Oceanic trade routes made the Baltic seem small. New shipping dynasties were emerging: the Dutch, the English, and soon the French. The world was growing faster, riskier, and less beholden to tradition. And the Hanseatic cities, rooted in medieval contracts and guild law, struggled to keep up. What happened to the clerks? As trade became more privatized and less regulated by communal rules, the need for the old kind of clerk declined. Instead of shared contours, merchants hired private secretaries, more flexible, more discreet, and loyal to individual business interests, not guilds or city alliances. The new generation of scribes worked in banks, insurance houses, and joint stock companies. They used Stede bookkeeping, a revolutionary method, imported from Italian city-states that emphasized balance sheets and profit margins over inventory tallies. The old Hanseatic clerks, trained to track crates of furs and tons of pitch across half a dozen ports, now seemed slow. Their format obsolete. Their language Middle-Low German, increasingly arcane. Their worldview static in a world that now demanded movement. They weren't fired, they were simply not replaced. The contours crumble. Each of the League's great contours faded in its own quiet way. The Steelyard, London. For centuries, this was the Hanse's nerve center in England. By the 1590s, it was closed by Queen Elizabeth I, who grew weary of foreign merchants claiming special privileges. The buildings were repurposed. The warehouses were razed. Clerks left quietly. Only a few architectural traces remain today, tucked beneath Cannon Street Station. Brex Bruges. As the Zwin Channel silted up, Bruges lost its harbor access. The trade moved to Antwerp, and the Hanseatic contour followed briefly before vanishing entirely. The ledgers in Bruges stopped mid-entry. Snowflake Bergen. The Briggen Wharf, once a hotbed of Hanse trade, slowly became a backwater. Norwegian power grew. Hanseatic privileges were revoked. Today, the wooden buildings are preserved, but the clerks are long gone. Evergreen Tree, Novgorod. Once the League's easternmost outpost, the contour fell victim to Russian centralization. Tsar Ivan III shut it down. German records were seized. The last scribes departed under watch. Each closure wasn't a battle, it was a bureaucratic expiration. When guilds no longer guaranteed relevance. One of the core structures of Hanseatic trade was the merchant guild. Guilds ensured pricing standards, protection abroad, language and customs consistency, shared legal frameworks. Clerks served as the eyes and hands of these guilds. But as capitalism grew more individualistic, guild-based trade seemed inefficient. Why abide by an agreement set by Lübeck when you could undercut the price yourself? Why submit to contour fees when you could lease your own warehouse? Merchants began to break ranks. Cities like Amsterdam, Gdansk, and Hamburg forged new, looser networks. The clerks, tied to structure, could not follow. They were not trained for competition, bribery, or corporate secrecy. They were trained to record and repeat. And so, their usefulness ended not in scandal or incompetence, but in irrelevance. What happened to the ledgers? Strangely, while the clerks disappeared, their ledgers did not. Libraries and archives across Europe still hold multi-volume shipping logs from Danzig and Lübeck, ink-stained manifests from Reval, Tallinn, annotated tax agreements between Hanseatic cities and foreign rulers. These documents are rarely read except by specialists. Their script is archaic, their language extinct. Their margins are filled with cross-references, legal clauses, and notations in shorthand. They're not thrilling, but they're startling in their detail. A single clerk's record from 1482 might note: 23 barrels herring in brine departed Wismar, bound for Bergen. Master, Johann Dake. Customs paid 4 Lübeck marks 2 pfennigs, 1 barrel suspected of spoilage mark with chalk. This is not history from kings or generals. It's logistics as life. Legacy in the margins. Though the Hanseatic clerks vanished, their influence is strangely modern. They helped define trade standardization across cultures, early customs enforcement, supply chain documentation, distributed record keeping, where no single central authority controlled all the data. In many ways, they were the precursors to spreadsheets, manifests, and even databases. Their world ran on ink and trust, on redundant records and consistent procedure. And while we may never know their names, we live in a world that still echoes with their habits. But a final question lingers. How did a vast, peaceful, paper-based empire come to rule the trade of an entire region, and yet disappear so completely from the popular imagination? History tends to remember noise, battles, treaties, thrones, and explosions. It favors the spectacular. But the Hanseatic League was none of these things. It was a quiet empire, made not of castles or crusades, but of contracts and consistency. And so when it ended, few noticed. There was no final war, no declaration, no dramatic collapse. It simply stopped mattering. And the clerks who had once counted ships and tracked herring by the barrel stopped being counted themselves. This final section explores how and why we forget systems that shape us, and what it means when order is no longer remembered. Why the Hanse was forgotten. At its height, the Hanseatic League controlled trade across all of northern Europe. It had customs houses in England. It negotiated exclusive rights with monarchs. It enforced embargoes and economic sanctions. It had its own legal system, enforced in foreign cities. But by the 17th century, the League had become a relic. And over time, historians began to focus elsewhere. Why? No central figure to celebrate. Unlike the Tudors or Habsburgs, the League had no kings or queens, no charismatic rulers, no dynastic drama. It was run by rotating councils and agreements, and that's hard to turn into legend. No big war to mark its end. The League faded as the power of nation-states grew. It didn't fall in flames, it was outcompeted, absorbed, and reorganized. Like a trade route slowly drying up, its disappearance had no date. Paper over spectacle. The League's greatest achievements were logistical, regulating fish prices, negotiating harbor access, maintaining common measurements. These are remarkable accomplishments, but not the kind that make epic tales. Deliberate erasure by rising powers. New states like England, Sweden, and the Netherlands wanted to control trade their own way. The League's treaties, exemptions, and privileges were quietly revoked. Its memory was, in some cases, actively replaced. And so, while it once shaped daily life for millions, the League became a marginal note in textbooks, a curiosity, a thing that used to exist. What we still owe the Hansa. Though forgotten by most, the Hanseatic League left behind tools we still use. Municipal independence. Cities like Hamburg and Bremen still hold the status of free and Hanseatic city. This dates back to their league privileges autonomous from surrounding rulers. Commercial law. Many of the foundations of maritime law, especially regarding contracts, shipping liability, and port duties, trace their roots to Hansa agreements. Accounting and consistency. The clerks' meticulous bookkeeping laid the foundation for accounting standards, from double-entry ledgers to customs forms. Shared governance models. The League functioned as an early form of multinational cooperation, with member cities voting, negotiating, and acting collectively long before the idea of the European Union. But perhaps its most powerful legacy is conceptual. That a society can be built not on domination, but on shared standards, predictable routines, and mutual economic interest. Ghosts of the clerks. While their names are mostly lost, the presence of the Hansa clerks remains in subtle ways. The old warehouses in Lübeck still bear the carved merchant marks that once told clerks where to stack the goods. Watermarks from 15th century paper mills, recorded in Hansa ledgers, are now used by historians to date anonymous documents. In modern archive rooms, boxes of parchment sit silently once flipped through daily by men hunched over tables, doing math by candlelight. We don't remember the clerks, but we live in a world shaped by their habits. Writing things down, creating procedures, keeping receipts, trusting systems. Their contribution was not invention, it was standardization. They didn't dream up new worlds. They kept the old ones intact and operational. How order fades. The disappearance of the Hansa clerks wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't even personal. It was simply the natural outcome of a world that no longer needed that kind of order. As new systems emerged, states, banks, corporations, the League's methods seemed outdated, and those who maintained the old way quietly stepped aside. This offers us a small but meaningful insight. Most systems do not collapse, they are replaced. And those who maintain them do not protest, they simply stop being hired, their forms stop being filed, their ledgers go unread. And then, centuries later, someone finds a brown-bound book in a museum box, opens it, and finds neat columns of ink and wonders. Who wrote this, and where did they go? Modern echoes. There are still institutions today that echo the Hanseatic rhythm. Customs offices checking crates against digital manifests. Shipping companies updating logs as containers cross oceans. Accountants verifying inventory counts with quiet certainty. Every receipt, every barcode, every declared value at a border that's a descendant of the clerk who once recorded barrels of salted herring in Reval. Their work was not glamorous, it was not rewarded, but it was resilient. And in an age obsessed with disruption, their story reminds us of the power of continuity. A gentle ending. There is no single name to close this chapter with. No final clerk, whose pen dried at the exact moment the League fell. No plaque. But perhaps that's fitting, because the Hanseatic League was never about individuals. It was about function. Its clerks did not seek fame, they sought accuracy. And in a way, their anonymity is a kind of victory proof that their system was bigger than ego, quieter than conquest, and deeper than memory. So when you next fill out a form, sign a shipping slip, or wonder why prices vary by region, pause. And ask yourself, what would a Hansa clerk have written in the margins of your modern world? Story 5. How to run a Roman bathhouse. If you lived in the city of Rome, or anywhere in its vast provinces from Lusitania to Asia Minor, there was one place you could always count on: a bathhouse. You could lose yourself for hours inside, steam in your pores, warm water on your skin, sandals slapping against tiled floors, soft murmurs echoing off the vaulted ceilings. To the modern ear, bathing might sound like a luxury, but in Rome it was infrastructure, a daily necessity, a social obligation. And for those who operated these massive machines of comfort, it was hard, gritty, and incredibly organized work. This is not a story about emperors. It's a story about boiler slaves, plumbers, public health, and 1,000 pounds of ash swept daily into a trench. What was a Roman bathhouse? Let's begin with the term thermae. The word comes from the Greek thermos, heat. Thermae were large, public bath complexes. Smaller, private, or local versions were called balneae. By the 2nd century CE, Rome was dotted with hundreds of these establishments, serving everyone from senators to freedmen. The largest bathhouses, like the baths of Caracalla or the baths of Diocletian, could host up to 1,600 people per day. But even in smaller towns, bathhouses were a cornerstone of daily life. Why bathe? For Romans, bathing wasn't just about cleanliness. It was about routine. Most citizens bathed once per day, typically in the late afternoon. Socializing. It was where business was discussed, poetry recited, and gossip exchanged. Health. Physicians encouraged bathing to balance the humors. Leisure. Bathing followed exercise and was often part of a full day's rhythm. Status. While cheap to enter, a well-groomed appearance was a symbol of refinement. In short, bathing was civilization distilled. Inside the baths, a tour. A typical Roman bathhouse included a series of chambers, arranged in a deliberate sequence. A poditerium, the changing room. Patrons undressed and stored their clothes in niches. Slaves or attendants often guarded belongings. Palestra, the exercise yard. Citizens would stretch, wrestle, or run laps to warm up. Tepidarium, a warm room, meant to begin the process of relaxation and sweating, often beautifully decorated. Caldarium, the hot room. This was the heart of the system, heated floors and walls, often with a hot plunge pool. Frigidarium, the cold plunge. A large cold pool to close the pores and refresh the body. Optional laconicum, a dry sweating room like a sauna. Some luxurious baths also had libraries, massage rooms, and gardens. Who ran the baths? Behind the marble and mosaics was an army of invisible laborers. Bricks 1. Furnicarii, the firemen. These were the men who stoked the fires beneath the hypocaust system, a Roman central heating system. They worked in brutal heat, hauling wood and feeding furnaces for 12 hours or more each day. The ash had to be shoveled constantly to prevent blockages. Slaves or low-status workers often held this job. Wrench 2. Plumbarii, the lead men. Roman pipes were made of lead plumbum. These workers maintained the water pressure, patched leaks, and rerouted flow if needed. They were more skilled and more prone to lead exposure. Sponge 3. Capsarii, the attendants. These were locker room guards and assistants. They kept an eye on clothing, helped patrons undress, and ran errands. Droplet 4. Aquarii, the water managers. Tasked with regulating incoming water from aqueducts and cisterns, especially to make sure there was enough pressure to run the caldarium. The hypocaust, Rome's hidden furnace. The marvel of Roman baths wasn't just the layout but the engineering. Beneath the floors of the tepidarium and caldarium were stacks of bricks pilli supporting a raised floor, hot air channels heated by furnaces, flues built into the walls carrying heat upward. This system allowed radiant heat to warm entire rooms. Water tanks above the furnaces ensured a steady supply of hot water. Maintaining a hypocaust meant keeping fires burning from before dawn to well past dusk, regularly clearing soot and ash, venting smoke correctly to prevent poisoning. In essence, bathhouses were heat factories with thousands of moving parts, and only the bather saw the finished product. Clean or not? Roman bathing might sound advanced, but was it sanitary? Water was not changed daily. Pools were large and filtration minimal. Communal oils and scrapers strigils were reused. Bathers sweated, exfoliated, and then plunged into the same pools. Lice, fungi, and infections were not uncommon. Yet Romans believed in cleansing by heat and scraping rather than soap. Their logic: sweat out the impurities, scrape them off, plunge in cold water, and emerge restored. The economics of bathing. Most public baths were either free or extremely cheap, often funded by wealthy patrons, emperors, or magistrates hoping to gain favor with the public. Costs came in the form of maintenance, wood, water, repairs; labor, dozens of employees; materials, oils, strigils, cleaning tools. Larger thermi could be sponsored by the state, often as a demonstration of imperial generosity. Private bathhouses did exist, but they were more common in villas or elite urban homes. A day in the life of a bath clerk. Some larger bathhouses had clerks not unlike the scribes of the Hanseatic League who managed staff schedules, recorded supply orders, tracked maintenance needs, calculated rations of firewood, oversaw expenditures for lead, tile, and marble repairs. These clerks were not highly ranked, but they were essential. Without them, the bathhouse would lose rhythm, and the entire city block might go without heat or clean water. A slippery social ladder. Bathhouses blurred class lines, but only to a point. Everyone could attend, but hours might be segregated by gender or restricted by class. Patrons with money brought slaves to help them undress and oil up. The very wealthy avoided public baths altogether, preferring private calderia. Still, for a few denarii, the average Roman could enjoy marble colonnades, heated floors, and painted ceilings, a reminder that they, too, were part of civilization. So as you walk through the imagined mists of the caldarium, consider the layers behind the comfort. The roar of fires below, the groaning of lead pipes in the walls, the silent footfalls of attendants, sweeping, stoking, refilling. The ledgers quietly tracking how many cords of wood would be needed for tomorrow. Roman bathhouses were more than luxury, they were a fragile, functional system, held together by people whose names are lost, but whose warmth still echoes in the steam. But we're left with a question. What happens when this delicate system begins to fail, when the water stops flowing and the firewood runs out? In its prime, the Roman bathhouse was a machine of daily life, regular as sunrise, reliable as a sundial's shadow. But like any machine, it needed constant fuel: wood for fire, labor for maintenance, water from distant mountains. And when that supply began to flicker, the bathhouse faltered, not in a sudden collapse, but in small, accumulating failures. Drips turned to dryness, warmth faded to chill, marble cracked, and no one came to mend it. This section traces the decline of Rome's public bathing system, a mirror not of decadence, but of infrastructure failure in slow motion. The empire's infrastructure web. To understand the decline, we must remember what held the bathhouses together. Aqueducts, gravity-fed systems bringing water from springs and rivers, often dozens of miles away. Roads essential for hauling wood, bricks, oils, and materials for repairs. Labor networks, slaves, freedmen, municipal workers, and clerks maintaining the buildings day and night. Imperial subsidies, funding from wealthy patrons or the emperor himself for free public access. Each bathhouse, no matter how grand, was a node in a larger imperial system. And as that system frayed in the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, the bathhouses became harder to sustain. Signs of strain. By the late 200s CE, the Roman world was entering what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a time of invasions, economic instability, plague, and rapid imperial turnover. The cracks showed up in places like stop sign aqueduct damage. Invasions or civil wars often led to broken aqueducts. Even minor disruptions could disable a bathhouse. In Gaul, raids cut off mountain water sources. In North Africa, desertification dried channels. In Rome, aqueducts were repeatedly sabotaged or fell into disrepair. Firewood shortages. As urban populations grew and nearby forests thinned, firewood became scarce, especially in winter. No fuel meant no hypocaust. No heat meant cold baths. Cold baths meant fewer patrons. Bricks neglected repairs. Without funding or manpower, tiled roofs leaked, plaster peeled, marble chipped, mosaics cracked and stayed cracked. What was once a symbol of order and cleanliness now began to resemble decay. The bureaucracy buckles. Behind the scenes, bathhouse administration suffered as well. Municipal clerks, once precise in tracking maintenance logs and firewood deliveries, now worked with shrinking budgets, irregular shipments, stolen or diverted supplies, emperors too preoccupied with war or inflation. Some provinces started closing their smaller thermae and redirecting resources only to the largest, most symbolic complexes. Smaller towns simply let them rot. One historian notes that by 300 CE, many rural baths in Britannia were used more by sheep than by citizens. Bathing as a privilege again. As resources tightened, free or cheap public access declined. In earlier centuries, even the poor could afford to bathe daily, but by the 4th century, entrance fees rose. Hours were reduced. Wealthy elites began to build private baths again, just as in the Republic. The bathhouse, once a leveler of class, now segregated the city again. Ironically, the return of elite bathing was a sign that Rome's public ideals were failing. Cleanliness became private. Infrastructure became gated. The Christian turn. Another turning point was ideological. As Christianity spread across the empire, attitudes toward bathing began to shift. Early Christian thinkers viewed public nudity, mixed bathing, and leisure in general with suspicion. Figures like Tertullian and John Chrysostom condemned the bathhouse as a place of vanity, lust, idleness, pagan indulgence. While bathing itself wasn't banned, communal, luxurious bathing became morally suspect. By the time of Constantine the Great, early 300 CE, some cities saw a cultural withdrawal from thermae. Baths of Caracalla, a case study. The baths of Caracalla in Rome are a haunting example of this slow decline. Completed in 216 CE, they were among the grandest thermae ever built, featuring 2,000 plus patrons per day, heated pools, gymnasiums, a library, vast gardens. But by the 530s CE, under Ostrogothic rule, they fell into disuse. Why? Earthquakes damaged the aqueducts. The city's population shrank dramatically. The state could no longer afford repairs. The complex was repurposed for stone scavenging. Today, the ruins still stand, arches hollowed, mosaics shattered, the pools empty. The boiler rooms are cold. The end of the furnace room. The last to leave were likely the furnicarii, those who stoked the fire. When there was no more fuel to burn, no more wages to collect, no more patrons to sweat, they let the embers die. A silent ending, no ceremony, just a furnace that was never relit. And when the warmth faded, so did a central part of Roman daily identity. Did bathhouses ever return? In some regions, yes. Byzantine cities preserved and adapted bath culture, often aligning it with Christian modesty. In the Islamic world, hammams evolved from Roman thermae, continuing the tradition of communal bathing. But the full-scale, publicly subsidized Roman bath open to all, engineered to perfection, humming daily in every city, was never quite reborn. In medieval Europe, bathing was often private, rare, or viewed with suspicion. It would take over 1,000 years before urban hygiene returned to the scale Rome once considered routine. Clerks again at the end. Even in decline, bathhouses needed clerks, though now their roles became simpler. Tallying fewer patrons, reporting damage that was never fixed, logging orders for wood that never arrived. Their ledgers still survive in fragments. 1/4th century papyrus from Egypt lists only. Day 11, cold, no water, fuel delayed, closed by mid-morning. Another entry from North Africa simply reads, public bath dry 3 days, manager fined, gate locked. No drama, just function lost and recorded without flourish. The smell of absence. Imagine walking past an abandoned Roman bathhouse in 390 CE. The doors hang loose on their hinges. The mosaics are faded. The hypocaust is cold. A trickle of water drips uncollected. Weeds grow in the palestra. But somewhere inside, there's still the ghost of heat, the faintest echo of sandals on tile, a moment where a city once believed that cleanliness was a civic duty and made it so. Now that belief is gone, and the building waits. So the question remains, what happens to a society that forgets how to maintain comfort and no longer sees it as worth the effort? By the time the last fires went out beneath the caldarium floors, most Romans didn't realize it was the end of an era. There was no decree, no announcement, no final bucket of water poured ceremoniously across hot stones. It just became normal that the bathhouse was closed, or cold, or crumbling. And yet the disappearance of Rome's bathhouses tells us something deeper than the decline of hygiene or public architecture. It reveals the invisible death of confidence. Not in military power, or coins, or emperors, but in the very idea that a city could organize itself well enough to provide comfort daily to everyone. Let us linger here, in the stillness of the final Roman bath, and ask what remains after the steam has cleared. The bathhouse as an ideal. To truly understand what was lost, we must remember what the bathhouse symbolized at Rome's height. It wasn't just a place to clean your body, it was a ritual of order. Every day, citizens passed through. The apoditerium to undress, the palestra to exercise, the tepidarium to warm, the caldarium to sweat, the frigidarium to cool, the atrium to dry and talk and read and socialize. This was urban choreography, rooted in infrastructure, shared expectations, and architectural rhythm. Bathing to the Romans meant participating in society even for a few minutes on equal ground. Rich and poor, merchant and soldier, citizen and freedman. The bathhouse was Rome's promise made real, that the empire could organize not only conquest, but comfort. When the baths fell, so did something else. So when the bathhouse began to crumble, it wasn't just the end of hot water. It was the slow, unnoticed end of an idea. That the city will take care of you. This erosion of public space and public trust may not have sparked rebellion or revolt, but it did reshape how people thought about daily life. Why gather if the gathering place was broken? Why exercise if no one maintains the field? Why trust the clerk's ledgers if no one reads them? And so quietly, the habits that once defined urban Roman life dissolved. Not because people were lazy, but because the system they counted on stopped counting them. What happened next? By the time the Western Roman Empire fell in 476 CE, many bathhouses were already shells of their former selves. But Rome didn't vanish overnight, it transformed. In the absence of public bathing, new rhythms emerged. Private bathing returned small tubs, wooden buckets, and heated stones in personal villas. Religious cleansing took on symbolic roles in monasteries and churches. Communal gathering moved to different places: the forum, the chapel, the tavern. But none of these replaced what the bathhouse once represented: a ritual of civic participation that was as ordinary as it was essential. The baths as ruins and symbols. As centuries passed, many bathhouses were looted for stone, their marble and lead repurposed for churches or homes. Abandoned to time, overgrown and unguarded. Admired as curiosities, especially during the Renaissance. Even the very word thermae came to sound old-fashioned. And yet, ironically, the baths became symbols of greatness in their decay. Poets wrote of their lost grandeur, travelers marveled at the collapsed domes, artists sketched their broken arches. The ruins whispered of a world that once cared enough to heat the floor beneath your feet. What the clerks left behind. We often forget that systems like these leave behind paper trails, even as the bricks fall. Scraps of bathhouse ledgers survive. Would ration logs from Gaul. Payroll records for firemen in North Africa. Water usage tables from Palmyra. Complaint notes from Roman Egypt about cold tepid area. These aren't dramatic. 1/5th century complaint reads: Caldarium cooled before second hour, ash pit not emptied, patrons refused entrance, remediate or risk fine. But these mundane notes, scribbled by anonymous clerks, are the last heartbeat of a system trying to stay alive. A legacy beyond Rome. Though the Roman bathhouse did not survive intact, its core principles did in ways the bathhouse clerks could never have imagined. Modern plumbing systems owe their origins to Roman aqueducts and drainage designs. Urban sanitation standards trace back to Rome's concern with shared hygiene. The very idea that governments should provide clean water, warmth, and wellness is Roman at its root. Even now, when cities build community centers with heated pools, saunas, and fitness spaces, they're echoing a 2,000-year-old Roman blueprint. What was really lost? So what did Rome lose when it lost its bathhouses? Not just steam or comfort. It lost rhythm. It lost public routine. It lost the sense that the city's heart beats with yours. When the floor grew cold, people didn't just shiver. They realized they were alone. The quiet fade of civic ritual. We rarely notice when public habits end. There's no funeral when the last municipal librarian leaves. No parade when the final train stops running its daily route. No monument to the last working drinking fountain in a quiet square. But these small losses add up. And in Rome, the bathhouse was the quietest and most profound loss of all. A closing reflection. Imagine standing now in the ruins of the baths of Caracalla, in modern Rome. The roof is gone. Grass grows where hot air once flowed. Pigeons nest where emperors once walked barefoot across marble. And yet in the silence, something lingers. The shape of a room built for shared heat. The curve of a wall designed to amplify conversation. The faint, dusty outline of a society that once believed every citizen should feel warm, clean, and included. So as we leave this story, one final question remains. What will future generations find when they walk through the ruins of our own public spaces? Will they still feel the warmth we once gave each other? Story 6. The Man Who Measured the World. Some stories in history start with war. Some with birthrights. But this one begins with a stick in the ground. It was the 3rd century BCE, in a city filled with knowledge, Alexandria, Egypt, and a man stood watching a shadow at high noon. His name was Eratosthenes. He was a librarian, a mathematician, a poet, a geographer, and by some accounts a bit of a grump. He wasn't a conqueror, he never ruled a kingdom, but he did something quieter and perhaps grander. He measured the earth not with a ship or compass, but with a pen, a sunbeam, and geometry. This is the story of how one man used books, sunlight, and curiosity to answer a question older than civilization itself. How big is the world really? A city built for thought. The tale begins in Alexandria, the coastal city founded by Alexander the Great and transformed into a sanctuary for scholars by the Ptolemies, Greek rulers of Egypt after Alexander's death. By the time Eratosthenes arrived in the mid-200s BCE, Alexandria was a hub of trade and maritime travel, home to the lighthouse of Pharos, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. Most importantly, home to the great library. The Library of Alexandria was not just a building. It was a mission to gather every book, scroll, and scrap of knowledge in the known world. Ships docking in Alexandria had their books confiscated, copied by scribes, and returned. The library's shelves allegedly up to 400,000 scrolls covered medicine, astronomy, drama, mathematics, philosophy, zoology, and geography. This was where Eratosthenes lived, worked, thought, and walked. Who was Eratosthenes? He was born around 276 BCE in the Greek city of Cyrene, modern Libya. He was educated in Athens, where he gained a reputation for wide-ranging curiosity, mathematical skill, a poetic sense of language, a slightly irritable personality leading some to nickname him Beta, implying second best at everything. But in Alexandria, he was more than Beta. He was appointed the chief librarian, the successor to Zenodorus and Callimachus, tasked with organizing the world's knowledge. Unlike other scholars who specialized, Eratosthenes was a generalist. He asked broad questions. How far is it to India? What is the shape of the earth? How does one map the heavens? But his most famous question was even simpler. Can we calculate the size of the earth from here? What the ancients knew. Let's pause. By Eratosthenes' time, educated Greeks already believed the earth was a sphere. This wasn't controversial. Philosophers like Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle had proposed it based on the curved shadow of Earth during lunar eclipses, the way ships disappear over the horizon, the differing constellations visible from north and south. But no one had yet measured the Earth's circumference with any real accuracy. Estimates ranged from wild guesses to armchair reasoning. Some thought it was too vast to know. Eratosthenes disagreed. The clue in the shadows. The idea struck him when he read a report from a distant Egyptian city, seen modern-day Aswan, roughly 800 km south of Alexandria. There at noon on the summer solstice, vertical sticks cast no shadow. Why? Because the sun was directly overhead. Meanwhile, in Alexandria on the same day and time, shadows did exist. He measured the angle, about 7.2 degrees from vertical. This difference intrigued him. He reasoned, if the earth is round and the sun is very far away, then this angle difference is caused by Earth's curvature. So if 7.2 degrees corresponds to the distance between Scene and Alexandria, then 360 degrees must be. He had his method. The calculation. Let's walk through his logic slowly. Measure the angle. In Alexandria, a stick cast a shadow. Using geometry, Eratosthenes determined the angle of the sun's rays was 7.2 degrees off vertical. That's 1/50 of a full circle. Measure the distance. The distance from Alexandria to Scene was estimated to be 5,000 stadia. A stadion is roughly 157.5 meters, but units varied. How did he know the distance? Possibly by camel caravan travel time or royal surveyor data along the Nile. Do the math. If 2 degrees equals 5,000 stadia, then 360 degrees equals x. Right arrow x equals 5,000 times 50 equals 250,000 stadia. In modern units, depending on the stadion used, this comes out to about 39,375 kilometers. The actual circumference of Earth, approximately 40,075 kilometers. Eratosthenes was off by less than 1%. Without satellites, without telescopes, without even accurate clocks. Just a shadow, a distance, and a mind that refused to guess. Why it mattered? Eratosthenes didn't just guess at geography, he created it. He invented the word geography itself, combining geo-earth and graphene to write. He also proposed a system of latitude and longitude, attempted to map the known world, wrote about ocean currents, wind patterns and climates, tried to determine the distance to the sun and moon. Though much of his work survives only in fragments or quotations, later scholars like Ptolemy, Strabo, and Hipparchus built their systems on Eratosthenes' foundation. He didn't just measure Earth, he created a framework for thinking globally. The personality behind the pages. Though brilliant, Eratosthenes was also very human. He was known to be irritable when asked to explain things twice. He once quarreled with rival scholars over errors in Homeric poetry. Some accounts suggest he went blind late in life and starved himself to death out of frustration. Yet he was beloved by his students for one key trait. He believed all knowledge was connected. He would quote poetry in a mathematical proof. He'd use geography to argue theology. His lectures might leap from logic to lyric and back again. In a world of specialists, Eratosthenes was a unifier, an open ending. Imagine him now, in the quiet of the great library, holding a scroll in one hand and a diagram in the other. Outside, the Mediterranean breeze pushes sand through the columns. Inside, a clerk adjusts a scroll catalog. Somewhere nearby, someone reads a Babylonian treatise on star positions. And there stands Eratosthenes, squinting at a line on parchment, wondering, if I can measure the world, can I map the heavens too? In the quiet logic of Eratosthenes' calculation, shadows, stadia, and circles, there was something deeper than geometry. There was a worldview. He had proven that the earth was not only round but measurable, that it had a knowable scale, a finite edge, and perhaps most radically a mappable surface. But what did that mean in practice? Section 2 explores how Eratosthenes, still seated behind his desk in the library of Alexandria, attempted the first scientific map of the world, based not on myths or hearsay, but measured distances, climate zones, and comparative geography. The task was immense. And yet, in the margins of forgotten scrolls, he began to redraw reality. Reinventing geography. Before Eratosthenes, geography was largely descriptive. Maps were often centered around sacred cities, like Delphi or Babylon, skewed by cultural or political importance, based on travel tales, legends, or poetic guesswork, marked by monsters, dragons, or unexplored edges. Eratosthenes, after measuring the Earth's circumference, approached the world differently. He believed geography should be mathematical, empirical, systematic, and so he set out to create a world map, one of the earliest ever attempted using grid-based reasoning. Latitude, climate, and the shape of the world. Eratosthenes divided the world into climate zones, based on latitude and sun exposure. The torrid zone near the equator, too hot for human life, he believed. the temperate zones flanking the equator, where humans could live and agriculture thrived. The frigid zones near the poles, too cold for sustained civilization. This may seem simplistic now, but it was revolutionary then. It implied the Earth was symmetrical, environmental conditions were predictable, human settlement followed natural rules. More than a map, this was a theory of human geography, attempting a global grid. He didn't stop with climate. Eratosthenes also proposed a grid system, lines of latitude and longitude, to position cities and landmarks more accurately. He estimated relative locations for Mara in Nubia, Babylon, Thule, a mysterious northern land, possibly Iceland or Norway, India based on traveler accounts, the Pillars of Heracles, modern-day Gibraltar. Many of these locations were placed incorrectly by modern standards, but the attempt using consistent units and coordinates was centuries ahead of its time. In fact, it wasn't until Ptolemy, nearly 400 years later, that the idea of latitude-longitude maps became mainstream. Eratosthenes was doing it on parchment, with reports from camel riders and sailors. Mapping by conversation. One of the remarkable features of his work was its dependence on shared human knowledge. Unlike explorers, Eratosthenes rarely traveled. He relied on travelers' reports, merchant logs, military records, ship captains' sun charts. He cross-referenced sources, triangulated travel durations, and even corrected for wind patterns and river speeds. This process was both empirical and humble. He did not assume perfection. He made room for error. "We must not be angry with geographers," he once wrote, "if they sometimes make mistakes, so long as they keep to probability." Building the first world map. So what did his world look like? Unfortunately, Eratosthenes' original map is lost. No copies survive. What we know comes from later summaries, especially by Strabo, a 1st century BCE geographer. According to them, his map included a central inhabited world, oikoumene, stretching from the Atlantic to India, a roughly rectangular layout, about 39,000 km in total width, close to the Earth's real circumference, a division into meridians and parallels, estimated coordinates for major cities and rivers. While distorted by modern standards, it was the most scientific map of its time and far more accurate than mythological ones. Why mapping mattered? To Eratosthenes, maps weren't just for sailors. They were for understanding the human condition. Mapping for him meant knowing where food could grow, understanding why people looked and lived differently, preparing better roads and armies, navigating the politics of empire with precision. In short, mapping the Earth meant managing it. It was power, not military power, but the power of foresight. The librarian's philosophy. More than just a geographer, Eratosthenes was a philosopher of scale. He constantly asked, what is the shape of systems? How do small patterns reveal global truths? Can a poem describe a city more accurately than a map? This blend of disciplines, math, myth, measurement, made his work strangely beautiful. He once described rivers as veins across the skin of the earth. He said the ocean was a breathing space between men. To him, mapping wasn't just political, it was poetic. Tensions with contemporaries. Despite his achievements, not everyone admired him. Hipparchus, an astronomer, criticized his maps for lacking astronomical alignment. Others mocked his wide-ranging focus, calling him a dilettante. Some philosophers accused him of trying to quantify things that should be left to gods. But Eratosthenes believed in what we might now call evidence-based inquiry. And from his desk in the library, he kept cataloging, correcting and calculating. An open ending. Let us pause now, in the map room of the great library. Scrolls are rolled out across the table. Ink is drying. The measured earth is being penciled into shape not with certainty, but with wonder. And in the margins, Eratosthenes jots a note to himself. Is the ocean between India and Africa navigable? A question for another generation. A shadow of a voyage to come. By the end, the world Eratosthenes had measured was one he could no longer see. Blindness came slowly, whether from age, disease, or simply time's wear. His biographers do not record the moment he noticed the light had faded, only that it faded and he knew. To the man who charted continents by shadows, this was more than a loss of sight. It was a silence of the senses, a final veil drawn across the earth he had so carefully sketched. And yet, in blindness, Eratosthenes became something larger than a librarian or a mathematician. He became a symbol of what it meant to know the world without ever needing to leave your chair. This is the story of how the last years of his life marked not an ending, but the long, slow survival of his ideas across burned shelves, collapsing empires, and centuries of forgetting. The final years. We know few details about Eratosthenes' last decade. He lived well into his 80s, remarkable for the time, and likely remained active in Alexandria until near the end. Still chief librarian, still surrounded by scrolls, still calculating. But when blindness took his sight, the work became impossible. He could no longer compare scrolls. He could no longer observe the sun or read merchant itineraries. His world, once composed of careful lines and geometries, was now blurred beyond reconstruction. Some accounts say he became withdrawn. Others say he attempted to continue through dictation. The most widely cited story claims he chose to starve himself to death, seeing no further purpose in life once he could no longer read or measure. Whether that's true or a poetic exaggeration, it reveals how closely his identity was tied to vision, precision, and clarity. Legacy under threat. If Eratosthenes died around 194 BCE, as many believe, he died just before a long dark period for Alexandrian knowledge. Within a few centuries, the Library of Alexandria would suffer fires, first accidentally under Julius Caesar's see in 48 BCE. Then possibly again in later wars. The rise of Rome would turn Egypt from an intellectual center into a provincial symbol. Christian and later Islamic scholars would reinterpret or erase many ancient sources, either through translation or loss. Earth's shape and size would be debated all over again, sometimes in ignorance of Eratosthenes' work. His scrolls, maps, and charts were largely lost, with only fragments quoted by later thinkers like Strabo, Ptolemy, Pliny, and others. He did not become a household name. Not until long after. The echoes of measurement. And yet his ideas never truly disappeared. Because others had read them, copied them, and carried them forward not in the original scrolls, but in paraphrases, notes, translations. Roman architects used his earth measurement to plan roads and aqueducts. Muslim scholars in Baghdad preserved his methods through translations into Arabic in the 9th century. Renaissance geographers like Gerardus Mercator and Tycho Brahe later acknowledged his methods even if they no longer knew his name in full. Even Christopher Columbus, centuries later, calculated his voyage using estimates partially derived from Eratosthenes, though ironically, Columbus underestimated Earth's circumference, unlike Eratosthenes, who had been more accurate. The forgotten accuracy. It's one of history's quiet ironies. Eratosthenes, with no telescopes, no clocks, no calculators, just a stick and a sunny afternoon, measured the Earth more accurately than many who came after him. Why was this forgotten? partly because his unit stadia varied, creating uncertainty, partly because maps were redrawn by politics and faith, but mostly because the infrastructure of knowledge preservation failed. His accuracy was lost not through disagreement, but through disuse. The idea of knowing the world. What did Eratosthenes teach in the end? Not just that the earth is measurable, but that we are capable of measuring it with nothing more than careful thought and consistent observation. His method was elegant not because it was simple, but because it was repeatable. It could be used by a sailor, a clerk, a student, a teacher. He made the world less mysterious, but no less wondrous. A legacy in numbers. Consider this. His estimate, km. True circumference, km. Difference, less than 2%. Modern GPS satellites orbit at altitudes calculated, using Earth's radius first approximated by Eratosthenes. Astronomers planning interplanetary missions still use spherical geometry based on principles he helped articulate. We orbit on an Earth defined in part by his hand. The human element. And yet, what makes Eratosthenes' story so compelling isn't the numbers. It's the image of him, an aging librarian, running fingers along dry parchment, talking to sailors, packing corridors lit by oil lamps, adjusting diagrams in his mind as he speaks aloud to a young student holding the chalk. He wasn't interested in conquest, temples, or prophecy. He wanted to know how far it was from one city to another, and what that could tell us about the cosmos. He wanted to know how a shadow could define a sphere. He wanted to know how to know. The measured world, revisited. Today you can fly from Sin, modern Aswan, to Alexandria in 90 minutes. But for Eratosthenes, that journey taken only on paper measured the entire planet. Not by force, not by fortune, but by paying attention. A final thought. Imagine standing in Alexandria today, by the Mediterranean. The library is long gone, the scrolls are ashes, the lighthouse has crumbled into the sea. But the sun still shines overhead. Shadows still fall at angles. And the earth beneath your feet is still spinning at a circumference first calculated, in silence, by a man with no tools beyond thought itself. So the question remains, what else in your own world waits quietly to be measured not by machines, but by the calm attention of your mind? Would you like to begin Story 7, Plague, Paperwork, and the Quiet Collapse the Bureaucrats of Byzantium? You said. Continue. ChatGPT said. Excellent, we now journey from sunlit scrolls to candlelit corridors, where the fate of an empire was once measured not in battles but in ink, seals, and silence. Story 7, Plague, Paperwork, and the Quiet Collapse. The Byzantines rarely shouted. Even as the empire crumbled and the walls cracked, they filed forms, stamped parchments, and revised tax codes. This is not the story of battlefield triumphs or great sieges. This is the story of a civilization held together by scribes, clerks, and copyists long after its emperors faded into ceremony and its armies lost ground. We begin in the 6th century CE, in a room far from the Hagia Sophia or the battlefields of Anatolia. A man sits hunched at a low desk. The ink is thick, the wax seals are warm, the candles flicker. He's a Basilica Grammatius, a state secretary, and he's about to issue a census directive that will shape the fate of thousands. He won't swing a sword, he'll dip a pen. And that in Byzantium was how the world turned. What was Byzantium really? The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire, surviving long after Rome fell in 476 CE. Centered in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, it lasted another 1,000 years, officially ending in 1453 with the Ottoman conquest. But Byzantium wasn't merely Roman light. It was a fusion of Greek culture, Christian theology, and Roman administration. A state obsessed with protocol, documentation, and hierarchy. An empire built more on paperwork than parade grounds. Its strength lay in systems. The tax rolls, the palace registries, the bureaucratic ranks, and the land registers. If Rome was marble and glory, Byzantium was vellum and survival. The heartbeat of the empire, the bureaucracy. Byzantine administration was a labyrinth of offices with names like Caecilius, keeper of the imperial purse; Chardularios II Canicleu, in charge of the emperor's ink pot; Logothetes II Dramo, head of communications and foreign intelligence; Protnotario, senior notary overseeing other scribes. These were not ceremonial titles. They wielded power. A well-placed note, forged seal, or unsigned directive could halt a military campaign, redirect food shipments, reassign land ownership, impose or forgive enormous tax burdens. Byzantium ran on paper, not loyalty. It survived siege and plague through forms, not force. A day in the life of a scribe. Let's slow the pace and enter a scribe's world, perhaps in the year 547 CE, in Constantinople's great palace. Morning begins with filling the ink horn with gall-based black ink, heating the wax tablet used for draft versions, copying entries from land registries onto durable parchment. The scribe is not alone. Dozens of clerks around him murmur formulas. On this day, in the reign of Justinian, the lands of the monastery at Nicomedia. The work is rhythmic, boring, repetitive. But this boredom is what holds the state together. Without it, roads go unrepaired, taxes go uncollected, grain shipments rot, soldiers go unpaid. Every name on the parchment is a real family. Every missed line is a famine waiting to happen. Paper versus plague. In 541 CE, the plague of Justinian swept across the empire, killing, by some estimates, up to 25 million people over the course of several outbreaks. The impact was catastrophic. Farm laborers vanished. Soldiers died in barracks. Merchants collapsed mid-route. Even Emperor Justinian himself was infected, but recovered. And yet the paperwork continued. Monasteries recorded deaths. Census agents revised population rolls. Grain allotments were recalculated based on empty households. It wasn't swift, it wasn't flawless, but it was systematic. Where other empires collapsed, Byzantium adapted on parchment. Even in grief, the scribes returned to their wax. Why did they write so much? Byzantines wrote everything down. Why? Legalism. As heirs of Roman law, Byzantines believed the state only functioned if it could be proven in writing. Theological order. Christian cosmology valued divine records, the Book of Life, Judgment Day scrolls. Earthly writing mirrored this celestial order. Imperial tradition. The emperor was not a god, but a manager of a divine kingdom on earth. His orders had to be precise. As a result, even minor officials kept archives. There were letters for monastic exemptions, naval requisitions, gold leaf shipments for mosaics, falcon licenses for the elite. Some scribes even developed shorthand symbols to speed up their copying. Others reused parchment, scraping off old texts, palimpsests, to write again. Every scroll was both present tool and future artifact. Cracks in the system. But over time, the bureaucracy began to rot. Offices became hereditary. Bribes greased promotions. Records were falsified to hide embezzlement. Corrupt logothetes ignored provincial complaints. Worst of all, the gap widened between what was recorded and what was real. A tax form might list 3,000 farmers in a district. In truth, only 1,100 remained. But the emperor, trusting the numbers, would tax as if nothing had changed. This mismatch between paper empire and physical empire would lead to rebellions, shortages, and eventually, a credibility crisis. But at this stage in our story, around the 6th century, the system still functioned. Barely. And it still believed in its ability to manage chaos with seal and scroll. An unfinished directive. Let us return to our scribe in the great palace. He's midway through drafting a directive for grain relief in Cappadocia. A messenger arrives breathless. Plague has reached Antioch. The clerk pauses, dips his pen again, and continues writing. He does not run, he does not pray. He writes the new location, adjusts the shipment date, and seals the scroll. The bureaucracy must adapt. And for now, it still can. An unresolved question. But as the ink dries and the candles gutter low, a question hovers over the silent desks. How long can an empire survive on paper alone? By the 9th century CE, the Byzantine bureaucracy had become something closer to a living organism than a tool. It persisted, regardless of who sat on the throne, who starved in the fields, or who died at sea. Like an old tree with hollow roots, it continued to flower even as its core had begun to rot. Section 2 takes us deeper into the bowels of this bureaucratic empire, past the polished marble of the palace and into the archival vaults, treasury ledgers, and forgotten provinces. We'll explore how cold records masked hot crises, and how the meticulous recording of names and taxes could not always keep pace with famine, fraud, and frontier rebellion. Because sometimes ink fails. The notebooks of the protonotarios. By the mid-9th century, the Byzantine administrative engine had become more complex than ever before. At the center of this growing web stood the protonotarios, a title meaning first notary. This senior scribe oversaw regional notaries across the empire, reported directly to ministers, and, in rare cases, the emperor. Maintained the canonicon, a kind of master ledger used for taxation and land assignment. The canonicon was no ordinary list. It was a rolling archive of who lived where, who owned what was owed to whom, what exemptions, privileges, or obligations applied. To the state, your identity was not your name. It was your tax designation, a number tied to land, productivity, and military obligation. And the protonotarios could shape this with the stroke of a pen. Frozen in ink. Let's pause on a seemingly dull example, a wheat farm in Paphlagonia near the Black Sea. In the canonicon, it might appear as Plot 14b, 34 modioi, taxed under Basilios, son of Nikephoros, tithe to be sent to Ancyra. But suppose Basilios had died in a local skirmish. His family had fled inland. The grain yield had fallen due to frost. No one had updated the record. The result: taxes were levied on a family no longer there. The shipment was never collected. Another region was blamed for shortfalls. The illusion of empire persisted on false data. Multiplied across hundreds of villages, the imperial record began to diverge from reality. The state appeared strong on paper, but the people had vanished from the ink. The quiet collapse of themes. Byzantium's military system, known as the theme system, relied on land for service arrangements. Farmers were granted small plots in exchange for military duty. Theoretically, this made soldiers self-sustaining. It tied military strength to agricultural output. It reduced dependence on mercenaries. But the system only worked if land was evenly distributed and regularly updated. By the 10th century, corrupt officials and wealthy families had begun consolidating land, bribed notaries to adjust the canonicon, created vast estates, latifundia, exempt from military duty. Soldiers disappeared, tax revenue dropped. But again, the paperwork showed no alarm. It took generations for emperors to realize the army on the scrolls didn't exist anymore. The illusion of continuity. Why did this happen? Because the Byzantine mind valued continuity over accuracy. The same forms were used, even if the values changed. The same ceremonies performed, even when the empire was poor. The same tax scrolls copied errors, and all generation after generation. To update the truth was to acknowledge instability. And instability, to a Byzantine bureaucrat, was heresy against the state. Better to record a false harvest than admit a lost village. Better to invent a merchant than explain an empty road. Dossier of the Dead. In the 11th century, a new archive was discovered in a treasury beneath the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople. It contained over 500 tax receipts, dozens of petitions for land redress, copies of imperial grants from the 7th–9th centuries. Most were tied to people who had been dead for decades. The documents had been copied and recopied as part of an annual ritual to reaffirm property rights. Even when the families disappeared, the scrolls were kept. Even when the land fell into ruin, the names lived on. The empire, in a sense, became a ghost state, its living energy drained, but its scribal shell preserved. Reform attempts and their failures. Several emperors tried to reverse this trend. Nicephorus I R 800–811 attempted new censuses. Romanos I Lecapinos R 900–944 issued land redistribution decrees. Basil II R 976–1025 cracked down on tax fraud and absentee landlords. But the reforms were temporary. Why? Because the bureaucracy itself had become self-preserving. Notaries protected their networks. Judges refused to acknowledge conflicting records. Local scribes had incentive to maintain inflated figures. And without reliable information, good governance became guesswork. A day in the archive. Let us now observe a clerk in Trebizond, 10th century. He is updating the local registry. A noble family has acquired 3 new vineyards. Their steward brings forged imperial documents. The clerk knows they are false. But he is underpaid. His son is sick. The steward offers a coin pouch and a smile. The clerk shrugs, adds a line to the ledger, seals the scroll. And just like that, history is rewritten. Truth deferred. By the 12th century, Byzantium's capital gleamed. The Hagia Sophia still rang with choirs. The mosaics sparkled with new gold leaf. Foreign ambassadors marveled at the city's grandeur. But outside the walls, provinces crumbled. Records grew outdated. Revolts went unnoticed for months. The empire still issued ornate documents with red ink and golden seals. But fewer messengers delivered them. Fewer ears heard them read aloud. The empire still believed its own paperwork, long after the paperwork had ceased to reflect anything real. A curious endnote. When Constantinople finally fell in 1453, the Ottomans were surprised to find many imperial offices still functioning. Secretaries still copied tax codes. Notaries still filed copies of ancient land deeds. Imperial scribes continued writing scrolls in Latin and Greek, as if the next emperor would arrive next week. In the end, the last Byzantines did not die with swords in hand. They died at their desks, still copying a world that no longer existed. An unresolved thought. So here we leave Byzantium's bureaucracy silent, steady, and strangely serene. It tried to hold back war, famine, and change with calm ink and cold wax. But it raises a question for our time. Can the systems we build outlive the reality they were designed to manage? When the end came, it was not sudden. It came in whispers, in fatting records, and in documents never delivered. The fall of the Byzantine Empire in 1453 is often told in cannon fire and crumbling stone, in the heroic defense of walls that had stood for a millennium. But beneath the battle, behind the banners, there was another death unfolding. The death of an empire built on administration, sustained not by war but by writing, and brought low not by enemies alone, but by the slow failure of the very systems that once preserved it. This is the final section of our journey through Byzantine bureaucracy. It ends with fire, yes, but before that, paper. An empire in name. By the 14th century, the Byzantine Empire was Byzantine only in name. Its territories had shrunk to a handful of cities and fragments of land. Constantinople, Thessaloniki, briefly, parts of the Peloponnese. Its economy was devastated. Its army was mostly mercenary. Its imperial court still sparkled, but it masked a decaying foundation. Yet the bureaucracy remained. Petitions were still filed. Land taxes still assessed. Monastic charters still copied by hand. Imperial scribes in dusty chancelleries continued using elaborate formulas that once governed provinces across 3 continents. They still addressed letters to the Count of Opsikion long after Opsikion was lost to the Turks. They still calculated naval budgets for fleets that no longer sailed. They still used the imperial dating system long after the empire had little time left. In many ways, the late Byzantine state persisted as a formality, a paper empire bound by habit, tradition, and ink. The final bureaucrats. Even as the empire dwindled, new offices were invented. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos, R 1391, 1425, established fresh honorary titles and created new ceremonial roles, many of which carried no real power. A clerk in the final century might have held one of these. Logothetes ton oikiakin, an accountant of the palace's private property. Protnotarios tu mystikou, keeper of the emperor's confidential correspondence. Canonarches, an officer of the liturgy, more symbolic than administrative. These officials walked in rotting corridors, stamping documents with seals that bore the double-headed eagle, even as the empire around them crumbled. Their wax was clean, their robes ceremonial, their pens steady, but their work no longer moved armies or fed provinces. It was the echo of an older empire, one that had already passed into memory. The archives of Mount Athos. One of the most haunting relics of this era can be found not in Constantinople, but in the monasteries of Mount Athos. There, tucked away in damp cellars, lie scrolls, charters, and crucibles, imperial edicts, issued by emperors whose lands had been taken centuries before. Many of these documents were renewals, not original grants, but reauthorizations of earlier decrees, issued simply to preserve a legal fiction of continuity. Some documents feature blank spaces, left for seals that were never affixed. Others are dated to regnal years of emperors already deposed or dead. Still others request land rights in regions occupied by the Ottomans or Serbians, areas the empire no longer controlled. And yet the monks copied them carefully, preserved them in cedar chests, catalogued them with loving precision. Because to the Byzantines, paper preserved legitimacy, even if power had fled. The Palaiologan revival and its paper mirror. During the 13th and 14th centuries, a minor revival took place under the Palaiologos dynasty. They retook Constantinople in 1261 and made limited attempts to reform both military and administrative systems. But these reforms were mostly surface level. The bureaucracy was pruned, but not replaced. The imperial chancery adopted more elaborate ceremonial language to hide its weakening reach. Legal forms became increasingly formulaic, often recycled from centuries-old precedents. In effect, the imperial court performed governance rather than enacting it. Even as tax revenue declined, the same ledgers were copied. Even as provinces seceded, the same regional offices were named. Even as power waned, the illusion was preserved in archival ink. By the 1400s, the empire was a theater of state, the stage intact, the actors still costumed, the script unchanged. Only the audience had left. The fall of Constantinople, 1453. In April 1453, the armies of Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople. The final emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, knew the odds. The city's defenders numbered barely 7,000. The Ottoman army exceeded 80,000. And yet, inside the palace of Blasharny, scribes still worked. On the eve of the city's fall, official proclamations were still issued. Clerks were still recording city expenditures. Letters were still being drafted to non-existent allies. Imperial documents were still stamped with gold-sealed wax. Some accounts suggest that in the final days, a notary recorded the names of every soldier stationed along the Theodosian walls, carefully organizing them by rank and location, knowing full well the information would never be used. It was a final act of order in a world descending into fire. The last archive. After the fall, the Ottomans did not immediately destroy the bureaucracy. Instead, Mehmed II retained many Byzantine officials, preserved tax records and land deeds, transformed parts of the imperial system into the Ottoman administration. The empire had changed. The rulers had changed. But the records strangely survived. In a quiet room beneath the former patriarchate, a Greek clerk trained under Byzantium continued his work, now under new masters. Different names, different seals, but the same ink. What survived? Very few Byzantine original documents from the capital itself remain. Fire, war, and time erased most. But fragments live on. In church archives in Greece, Serbia, and Bulgaria. In monastic records in Sinai and Athos. In Arabic, Latin, and Armenian translations. In palimpsest, used centuries later for newer texts. From these scraps we know how land was divided, how wine taxes were calculated, how imperial grants were worded, how death, divorce, property, and punishment were handled. We know what time monks had to wake. We know how much a horse cost in Galata. We know the compensation for a broken oath. All boring on the surface. But together, these details offer a lens into how an empire thought. Final reflections. The fall of Byzantium did not happen in a moment. It happened in the slow drying of ink. In the false numbers entered to hide decline. In the traditions repeated long after they held meaning. In the belief that form alone could sustain function. And yet, even in its collapse, Byzantium gave the world something extraordinary. A model of administrative persistence. A deep record of everyday governance. A reminder that empires are not just swords and cities, but clerks, pens, and policies. In the end, what outlived the emperors were not their crowns, but their copies. A final question. So we close the scroll on Byzantium. But before the ink fades entirely, we might ask, when our own systems crack, when the databases fail, the forms break, the networks disconnect, what legacy will our paperless bureaucracy leave behind? Or perhaps more quietly, what's written now that no one will read for 1,000 years?